She gave him 3 years of her life, 3 years hiding her true identity behind the shadow of an unworthy man. And tonight, Elias Mercer only needs one sentence to erase it all. You mean nothing to me. But what Elias doesn't know, what the entire Manhattan underworld is about to witness, is that the most powerful man in the city has been secretly watching Seraphina Vale for a long time. And tonight, he'll be coming to pick her up. Follow the story to the end, like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. The rain had been falling since 5 in the afternoon, and by the time Seraphina Vale stepped off the private elevator into the penthouse, the city below looked like a smear of broken light. She carried a folder against her chest. Inside it, the quarterly projections Elias had asked for by 8 o'clock. She'd had them ready by 6. She always had everything ready early. That was the kind of woman she was. The kind who built buffer into every timeline, who anticipated the problem before it became one, who quietly absorbed the chaos so the man at the top never had to break his stride. She'd been doing it for 3 years. She should have charged more. The penthouse was too large for 2 people, but Elias had insisted on it. Floor-to-ceiling glass on every wall, the kind of view that made you feel like you were standing inside something sacred. Manhattan spread out in every direction, towers lit against the dark sky, the Hudson invisible somewhere beyond the rain. The furniture was European, expensive, selected by an interior designer Elias had never once thanked by name. The carpet was so thick it swallowed the sound of her heels. He was at the mirror in the master suite. Both doors were open. She could see him from the foyer. He was in a dinner jacket, black on black, cufflinks catching the light as he worked them through the buttonholes. His hair was perfect. His face was unreadable. He was, by almost every measurable standard, a beautiful man. She had spent 3 years telling herself that was enough. I have the projections, she said, stepping into the room's threshold, not crossing it. Some part of her had always known not to cross it uninvited. He didn't look up. Leave them on the console. She set the folder down. Q3 is stronger than projected. The Harmon account came through, and the situation with the Del Vecchio contract. I resolved it. There were 3 outstanding issues, and Sarah. His voice was flat. Not unkind exactly. Worse than unkind. I don't need a report. She stopped. He turned from the mirror then, but only to pick up his phone, scroll briefly, set it face down again. He looked at her the way you look at a painting you've passed every morning for so long that you've stopped actually seeing it. I need to tell you something, he said. Something in her chest pulled tight. Not surprise, not exactly. More like the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath and finally stopped trying to hold it. Okay, she said. I'm done pretending this relationship means anything. The words arrived cleanly. No fumble, no softening. He'd clearly rehearsed them, or perhaps they hadn't required rehearsal. Perhaps they'd been sitting there on the surface of him for a long time, waiting for a convenient moment. She said nothing. He walked to the credenza, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, didn't offer her any. It's been over for a long time. I've been fair to you. I've given you work, security, access to things most women in this city would kill for. But I have to be honest, what we had... He paused, as if selecting from a menu of phrases. It was useful, past tense. Useful, she repeated. Don't do that. Don't stand there looking at me like I've just shot a dog. You're smarter than that. I am smarter than that. Her voice came out quiet, steadier than she expected, which is why I want to understand what exactly is happening right now. Elias set down his glass. He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time in the conversation, perhaps for the first time in months. There was something in his expression she couldn't name. Not guilt, not quite contempt, something in between that she suspected had no name because decent people didn't tend to feel it. Her name is Vivian Alcott, he said. Her family controls 7 of the 12 port operations on the eastern seaboard. Her uncle sits on 3 defense contracts. I've been building toward this for over a year. A pause. The engagement will be announced next month. The carpet swallowed the sound of her breathing. You've been building toward this, she said slowly, for over a year. Business requires certain alliances. She stopped. Started again. While I was managing your accounts, handling your exposure with the Del Vecchio family, covering the discrepancy in the Whitmore Fund so the SEC didn't find a thread worth pulling. All of that while you were compensated. I was in love with you. The words surprised her as much as they surprised him, not because they weren't true, but because she realized as she said them that they had stopped being true at some point without her noticing. What she was naming wasn't love anymore. It was something else. The fossilized shape of it, the outline of a thing long dead. Elias had the decency, or maybe just the reflexive social calibration, to look momentarily uncomfortable. Then it passed. You're too soft for the world I operate in, Seraphina. I've always known that. I thought it was something you could outgrow. He reached for his jacket from the valet stand. You never did. Too soft, she said. You have a conscience. It slows you down. She looked at him. This man she'd rearranged her entire life to accommodate. This man whose crises she'd swallowed into herself like a stone so that he could sleep through the night. She had folded her ambitions into origami shapes small enough to fit in his shadow, and he was standing here telling her the problem was that she had a conscience. Clear out your office before morning, he said. I'll have HR handle the severance. You'll be fairly treated. I'm not cruel, whatever you may think of me right now. He shrugged into the jacket, checked his reflection, satisfied. There's a gala tonight, he added. The Belladonna. I'd prefer you not be there. He left. The elevator doors closed. The penthouse held its silence like a held breath. Quotum. Seraphina stood in the middle of Elias Mercer's living room for approximately 4 minutes without moving. She was aware of the rain against the glass. She was aware of the folder sitting on the console. The folder she'd spent 6 hours preparing, full of numbers that would now benefit a woman named Vivian Alcott. She was aware that her hands were completely still, which struck her as strange because she had expected them to shake. They didn't shake. She walked to the window instead. Manhattan below. The gala would be at the Aldrich, she knew. The Belladonna always used the Aldrich, 3 floors of a building that was technically a museum and technically available for private events if you knew who to call. She'd called them on Elias's behalf twice. She knew the guest list. She knew it because she had vetted the guest list on Elias's behalf 6 weeks ago when the invitations went out. She knew who would be in that ballroom tonight: 4 sitting senators, a former Secretary of State, 11 active CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, and somewhere among the more discreetly listed names, the names that didn't show up in any public record, the heads of 5 of the 7 recognized crime families on the East Coast. She had memorized the name at the top of that second list. Roman Castellano. She had never met him. She had seen photographs, or what passed for photographs, grainy security feeds and long lens shots that his people managed to keep out of mainstream circulation. She knew his reputation the way everyone who moved in Elias's orbit knew it. Not through stories told, but through the spaces where stories were deliberately not told. The careful pauses, the lowered voices. The way Elias, who feared almost nothing, had once left a room when Roman Castellano's name came up at a dinner table. She had Roman Castellano's personal number in her phone because Elias kept a crisis contact list and she maintained it. She had never called it. She had been careful never to have any reason to call it. She looked at the rain. She thought about the folder on the console. 3 years of her life and the numbers inside it. 3 years of absorbing consequences and managing exposures and keeping her mouth closed when she should have opened it. She thought about useful, past tense. She picked up her phone. Wolstam. It rang twice. Vale. The voice was low, unhurried, with a slight roughness at the edges. Not the kind that came from age, but the kind that came from choosing words carefully for so long that every word carried deliberate weight. She had not planned what to say. That was unusual for her. She usually planned everything. Mr. Castellano, she said. My name is Seraphina Vale. I was Elias Mercer's executive secretary and chief operating consultant, and most other things apparently, except anything that counted. She stopped. That last part had come out wrong, or possibly too right. A pause. Then, I know who you are. She hadn't expected that. You do. I've known who you are for 2 years. Nothing in his voice suggested this was meant to unsettle her. He said it the way you state a fact, because it was one. What happened tonight? She was quiet for a moment. He's announced an engagement. Vivian Alcott. I'm aware of the Alcott negotiations. No surprise there either. That's not what I'm asking. She understood then what he was asking. She answered it directly because Roman Castellano struck her, even through a phone connection, as a man who would notice if you answered a different question than the one he'd asked. He told me to clear out my office before morning, she said. He told me I was too soft for his world. He told me what we had was... She paused, chose precision over sentiment. Useful, past tense. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had a quality to it, attentive, measuring. He said that, Castellano said finally. He said that. Come to the gala with me. She felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement. Steadier than that. Something structural. Like a load-bearing wall she hadn't known was there, discovering what it was built to carry. That's an interesting offer, she said. It's not an offer. It's an invitation. There's a difference. A pause. You have approximately 90 minutes to decide whether to waste the rest of your evening alone in that penthouse or to walk into a room with me where every relevant person in this city will be watching. Another pause. I suspect you already know which one you're going to choose. She looked at the rain. She thought about the folder on the console. She thought about too soft. What should I wear? She said. The SUVs arrived 47 minutes later. Not one, 4 of them, black, armored by the look of the reinforced wheel wells and the height of the chassis, moving in tight formation through the rain-slicked streets below her building. She watched them from the lobby window, her bag over her shoulder, her coat on. She had changed in 26 minutes, silver-black satin that had been hanging in her closet for 8 months, waiting for an occasion she hadn't found with Elias, because Elias preferred her in something quieter at his events. Something that wouldn't draw more attention than him. She had bought this dress for herself. She was going to wear it for herself. The driver who came to the door was enormous and professional and addressed her as Ms. Vale, which suggested she had been expected, which suggested arrangements had been made, which meant Roman Castellano had spent at least part of that 90-minute window making calls. The thought was arresting. Not because it was frightening, though it perhaps should have been, but because it suggested something she hadn't expected. Preparation. Consideration. The same qualities she had spent 3 years providing to a man who'd never acknowledged them. Being on the receiving end felt foreign, almost suspicious. The interior of the SUV was black leather and smoked glass and absolute silence. The driver didn't offer conversation. She didn't ask for it. The city moved past the windows, blurred by rain and speed, and the particular quality of late evening light in Manhattan in November, everything amber and cold and wet. She sat with her hands in her lap and made herself think clearly. Roman Castellano, 41 years old, third generation. His grandfather had come from Palermo with nothing except a particular talent for organizing men and information. His father had built the organization into something that could move through legitimate business the way water moves through soil, invisibly, pervasively, shaping everything around it without being seen. Roman had taken over at 33 after his father's stroke and had, by all available intelligence, and she had considerable available intelligence, not merely maintained it but expanded it in ways that were architecturally different from anything his predecessors had done. Less violence, more leverage, the kind of power that was scarier, actually, than the kind that announced itself with guns. Elias had been trying to formalize a relationship with the Castellano organization for 2 years. He'd mentioned it obliquely, in the way he mentioned things he didn't want her to directly analyze. She had analyzed them anyway. She was very curious why Roman Castellano had known her name for 2 years. The SUV slowed, stopped. The driver's door opened and then hers, and the rain had mostly stopped now. A fine mist hanging in the air, catching the light from the Aldrich's entrance like something from a different era. Red carpet that wasn't technically red. Men in dark suits at the doors. The particular low roar of several hundred important people in a large room, audible even from here. She stepped out, and Roman Castellano was waiting at the top of the steps. Well, she had seen photographs. They did not adequately prepare her. He was tall. She'd known that. But height in photographs was abstract. In person, it was specific. He stood at the top of the steps with the ease of someone for whom standing still was a form of authority. His jacket a dark charcoal that had been made for him, not purchased. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides, and his face was not handsome in the way Elias was handsome. Elias had the kind of face that worked hard at itself, maintained itself, performed its attractiveness with conscious effort. Roman Castellano's face was something else, something that had been built for purpose rather than display. A jaw that looked like it had absorbed things without breaking. Eyes that were assessing her right now with an attention so focused it felt almost physical. He came down 2 steps to meet her, unhurried. "Ms. Vale," he said. "Mr. Castellano." He offered his arm. She took it. His sleeve was dry. There was an umbrella somewhere that had already been dealt with, she understood, by people whose job it was to deal with such things before he had to think about them. "How are you doing?" he said as they moved toward the entrance. Not a question. An observation framed his courtesy. "I've been better," she said. "I've been worse." That's an honest answer. "You seem like someone who prefers honest answers." "I do." He glanced at her sideways briefly. "I also seem to most people like someone who is simply tolerating the presence of others, in case you were planning to interpret my manner as indifference." She almost smiled. "I wasn't." "Good." The doors opened. The Belladonna Gala was exactly what she had imagined, and nothing like what she had imagined. She had processed the guest list. She had handled the logistics. She had operated at the administrative surface of this world for 3 years, handling its paperwork and its phone calls and its exposure management, but she had never been inside it, not like this. The ballroom of the Aldrich was 3 stories of marble and gilt and light, the kind of space that made you viscerally aware of how deliberately it had been built to dwarf you. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung overhead. The floor was black and white herringbone stone that had been polished to a mirror. An orchestra was playing something low and European in the far corner. Waitstaff moved through the crowd like water. And the crowd. She saw them the way she now saw them, not as names on a list, but as architectures of power, assembled in a single room. A senator she recognized from 3 congressional hearings. A woman who ran the 3rd largest private equity fund in North America. Men she recognized from the 2nd list, the careful list, standing in small clusters, wearing expensive suits, speaking quietly in Italian or in English. Their body language, the particular combination of relaxation and awareness that came from spending decades in rooms where the wrong word could end a business or a life. And then the room became aware of her. It happened incrementally. A turned head here, a broken conversation there. She felt it moving through the space like a current, people's attention pivoting on some axis she couldn't fully see. She understood somewhere beneath conscious thought that it was not entirely her doing, that walking beside Roman Castellano in this room was the operative variable. But she also understood that it was not entirely him either. There was something in the way she moved. She'd been trained to be invisible. She had been invisible, expertly, for 3 years. And now she'd made a single different choice. And the invisibility had inverted somehow, become its opposite. A Mafia captain she recognized, Genovese, 3rd tier, actually straightened his back as they passed. Roman leaned slightly toward her without looking at her. "They're trying to figure out who you are," he said quietly. "What will they conclude? That you're considerably more significant than you should be." A pause. "They'll be right." Across the ballroom, she found Elias. He was by the bar. The woman beside him, Vivienne Alcott, was tall, auburn-haired, beautiful in the way expensive things were beautiful. Elias was leaning toward her with the particular body language Seraphina recognized from the early months of their own relationship, attentive, performative, working at it. Then he looked up. His expression moved through surprise, incomprehension, and something she recognized distantly as fear. Not of her, she understood, but of what her presence here meant, of the recalculation it required, in approximately 2 seconds. She watched it happen. She didn't look away. She let him see that she was watching it happen. Then she looked back at Roman. "He's seen us," she said. "I know," Roman said. He sounded entirely unsurprised, as if this exact moment had been precisely what he'd anticipated. She thought about asking him how long he'd been planning this. She thought about asking why. Why her? Why tonight? Why the call had been answered, not just answered, but acted upon within the hour. She thought about the fact that he'd said, "I've known who you are for 2 years." She didn't ask. Not yet. Some questions needed to be earned. Roman accepted 2 glasses of champagne from a passing tray and handed one to her. He didn't toast. He surveyed the room the way a man surveys terrain, not with anxiety, but with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read what rooms contain before the room knows it's being read. "There are 3 people in this ballroom tonight," he said conversationally, "who are here specifically to assess my situation, whether I'm weakening, whether the organization has gaps, whether this is a good time to make a move." She followed his gaze without making it obvious. "The man by the east pillar," she said. "He's been watching your security rotation for the last 4 minutes, and the woman in green near the orchestra, she's been watching him watch you." Silence. Then, "Most people don't pick that up in their first 3 minutes in a room." "I managed Elias Mercer's threat exposure for 3 years," she said. "I learned to read rooms." "You learned to read rooms," he agreed, with something in his tone she couldn't quite categorize. "Because no one else was doing it, and you understood that if you didn't, eventually something would go wrong that couldn't be fixed." He looked at her directly then. "You spent 3 years being the structural integrity of someone else's empire, and he told you tonight that you were too soft." The words arrived somewhere in her chest and didn't leave. "He did," she said. Roman turned back to the room, took a measured sip of his champagne, said, in the same even tone, "He's going to regret that for the rest of his life," which, given some of the decisions he's been making recently, may not be as long as he anticipates. She understood that was not a threat, specifically. It was an observation. Roman Castellano, she was beginning to understand, dealt primarily in observations, and the reason they were frightening was that he was very rarely wrong. She turned to look at Elias again across the ballroom. He was still watching her. Vivian Alcott had said something to him that he hadn't heard because he was watching Seraphina. His expression had settled into something harder now, something deliberate, and she recognized it. The face he put on when he'd decided to act, to intervene, to reassert some control over a situation that had slipped past his management. He was going to come over. She could see it in the way his weight shifted, the way he set down his glass. 3 years of reading that man, and now she was reading him from across a room she hadn't been supposed to enter, wearing a dress she'd bought for herself, standing beside the one person in this city he could not manage or intimidate or fold into his narrative. She took a sip of her champagne. Let him come. He came within 4 minutes. Vivian Alcott was not with him. He'd found a reason to separate from her, some social errand she'd been dispatched on, and now he was crossing the floor alone, his expression arranged into something that wanted to look casual and wasn't. The jaw just slightly too set, the stride just slightly too deliberate. He stopped in front of them. "Seraphina," he said. "Elias." She gave him nothing in her voice. Not coldness. That would have been something. Just the absence of investment. His eyes moved to Roman. A muscle in his cheek worked briefly. "Castellano." He extended a hand. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Roman looked at the hand, then he looked at Elias. "We haven't," Roman said. He did not take the hand. 3 seconds of silence stretched to 5, and in those 5 seconds something happened to Elias Mercer's face that Seraphina had never seen happen to it before. The hand came down. "Seraphina," Elias said, shifting back to her, recalibrating. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding tonight. The things I said were clear," she said. "They were very clear, Elias. That was actually the problem. I was stressed. The announcement, the situation with Vivian is complicated, and You were not stressed." She kept her voice level. She was aware of Roman beside her, still and attentive, saying nothing. "You were deliberate. You rehearsed those words. And you were right about one thing. You weren't cruel. You were simply honest, and now I'm being honest in return. We're done." Elias's expression tightened. She had never spoken to him this way. 3 years and she had never spoken to him this way, had absorbed and deflected and managed, and she could see the specific shock of it in him. Not the content of the words, but the delivery, the spine in it that he had told himself she didn't have. "You don't understand what you're walking into," he said, quieter now, his voice dropping to something private, urgent. He was not speaking to her now. He was speaking past her, to Roman. With respect, this woman has been running administrative support for 3 years. She's capable in her lane, but you'd be making a mistake treating her as Mr. Mercer. Roman's voice arrived in the conversation the way a door closing arrives. Quiet, final, requiring no force to make its point. I'm going to say something to you, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond. Elias went still. You had 3 years with the most capable person in your organization, Roman said. She managed your exposure, your relationships, and your operational risk with a precision that kept you from 3 potentially catastrophic outcomes. I know this because I watched it happen in real time, from the outside, and I was aware each time. He paused. You threw her away tonight, in a penthouse. With cufflinks you were adjusting in the mirror, and your explanation was that she was too soft. The ballroom noise continued around them. The orchestra played, glasses clinked. You mistook kindness for weakness, Roman said, and loyalty for limitation, and the fact that you cannot see what you had is the most useful piece of information I've gathered about you in 2 years. Elias opened his mouth. That was the end of the conversation, Roman said. It was 23 minutes later, near the back of the East Gallery, that Seraphina finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the evening. Roman had been pulled into a conversation with 2 men she recognized from the careful list, the Farrugia brothers, who ran shipping operations out of Baltimore and were allegedly considering a change in certain allegiances. He'd excused himself briefly, which was possibly a test of some kind or possibly simply business, and she found herself standing near a window with a second glass of champagne she was not drinking. The adrenaline of the conversation with Elias was metabolizing, leaving behind something more complicated. She was not second-guessing. That wasn't it. She had not made any impulsive decisions tonight. Or if she had, they had been the first impulsive decisions in 3 years that she had made entirely for herself. She was not second-guessing, but she was aware of what she did not know. She did not know why Roman Castellano had answered that call. She did not know what he wanted from her. She did not know whether this evening was an act of genuine recognition or an elaborate recruitment dressed as rescue. She had spent 3 years in a world where almost nothing was what it presented itself as, and she was not naive enough to believe that she'd stepped from that world into a simpler one. She heard footsteps and turned, expecting Roman. It was not Roman. The man approaching her was heavy-set, 50s, with the kind of face that had decided a long time ago not to bother with expression. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that the conversation was private, far enough that it could be denied. Ms. Vale, he said. His voice had a Georgian softness under it, which didn't match his eyes at all. I represent certain interests who've been watching Mr. Castellano's organization with some attention. We understand you've recently become available. She looked at him. Mr. Castellano is a man of considerable resources, the man continued, but he is also a man of considerable enemies. We believe he's planning to announce a new position tonight, an advisory appointment that would give you significant access to his financial architecture. Before you accept such a position, you'd like me to share what I learned, she said. A slight nod. She held his gaze for a long moment. She was aware of the weight of what was happening, aware that she was standing at a fork that she would not be able to unstand at, that the choice she made in the next 20 seconds would define what kind of person she was going to be in whatever came next. She also thought about Elias Mercer, who had looked at her 3 years of loyalty and called it useful, past tense. And she thought about something Roman had said to her in the car, quietly, almost to himself, as if he'd forgotten she was there. The rarest thing in this world is not intelligence. It's someone who can be trusted with it. I'm going to need you to give me a name, she said to the heavy-set man. The name of who you're working for, right now, because I'm going to tell Roman Castellano about this conversation within the next 10 minutes, and when I do, I want to give him the complete information. The man's expression shifted, fractionally. You'd be making a significant enemy. I made an enemy of Elias Mercer tonight, and I'm still standing, she said. I'm not particularly frightened of significant enemies. She walked away from him. Her hands, she noticed, still weren't shaking. But she found Roman at the edge of the gallery. The Farrugia conversation concluded, a glass of water now in place of the champagne. He was watching the room with his back to the wall. She filed that away. And when he saw her approaching, he read something in her face immediately. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she watched something very precise happen in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but the cold satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. "Vasquez," he said, "the man you described. He works for a man named Aldrich Poole, who has been running financial intelligence operations against my organization for 14 months. You knew he'd be here tonight." "I suspected." He looked at her. "I didn't know he'd approach you." "He approached me within 20 minutes of us arriving." She paused. "Which means either he's been watching you long enough to know you'd bring someone new tonight, or he was watching me long enough to know who I'd bring," Roman said. He said it quietly, and the implication sat between them in the space of a breath. "You knew he'd come to me," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was something that required answering. Roman set down his glass. He turned to face her directly, and his full attention was a specific thing. Not comfortable, but oddly clarifying, like a room where all the unnecessary furniture had been removed. "I knew someone would," he said. "I didn't manufacture it. I didn't arrange it, but I've been in this world long enough to know that when a man like me walks in with a woman like you on his arm, certain people move in ways that tell me things I need to know." A pause. "I also knew, if I'm being completely honest, that you would make the right choice, because I have been watching you for 2 years. "Why?" she said. Not aggressive, just direct, requiring an answer. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, because 3 times in the last 24 months, I watched you absorb operational risk for Elias Mercer that he created, clean it up with precision, and then not use it. You had leverage over him on at least 2 occasions that would have been significant leverage, and you didn't use it. Either because you were loyal, or because you were in love, or because I thought it was wrong," she said. He looked at her. "I thought it was wrong to use people's mistakes against them when the point was to fix the problem," she said. "Not because I didn't see the leverage. I saw it. I just thought the leverage wasn't the point." Roman Castellano looked at her for a long, measuring moment, and then, for the first time all evening, he almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close enough that she saw it in the slight change at the corners of his eyes, in the way some tension she hadn't realized was there released itself from around his mouth. "Vasquez will have reported back by now," he said, returning to the present with the ease of someone who'd briefly allowed himself something and was now putting it away. "Poole will make a move before the evening is over. He may already be doing it." He turned, scanned the room, and she watched him track something across the ballroom that she hadn't yet identified. "Whatever happens in the next hour—" He stopped. His eyes had found something. She followed his gaze. The man she'd identified by the east pillar, the one watching Roman's security rotation, was no longer by the east pillar. The woman in green near the orchestra, the one watching the man by the east pillar, was also gone. "Stay close," Roman said. His voice was the same even register. No urgency in it, just a calibration, the way you'd recalibrate a setting rather than throw an alarm. She stayed close. And somewhere above them, in the darkness of the upper balcony, she heard the particular sound she'd learned from 3 years of managing Elias's security reports. The sound of a door opening that wasn't supposed to open. The sound of something that wasn't supposed to be there. She put her hand on Roman's arm. "Upper left balcony," she said, already moving. "Third door from the corner. Someone's through it." Roman's eyes went there. His hand found her back, not guiding, but ready. "How certain are you?" "The sound," she said. "The seal on those doors. I checked the venue schematics 6 weeks ago when I was preparing Elias's security brief. Those doors don't open quietly. That one just did." A beat. In that beat, his entire attention was on her face, not the balcony, reading her. "Completely certain," he said. It wasn't a question. "Completely," she said. He moved, bringing her with him, and somewhere above the ballroom, a crystal chandelier exploded into light and chaos. The chandelier didn't fall. That was the first thing Seraphina registered, that the explosion of light and sound above them was not structural, was not the building coming apart, was something more controlled and more deliberate than that. A percussive charge. Small, designed not to kill but to blind, to disorient, to turn 300 people in formal wear into 300 people running in three directions at once, with champagne in their hands and nowhere rational to go. The second thing she registered was Roman's hand at her back, firm and immediate, not panicked, moving her laterally toward the east wall with the specific efficiency of someone who had planned for this room, this moment, this category of event, not this exact event perhaps, but its genus. He had been in rooms like this before. His body knew what to do before his conscious mind had finished processing. The third thing she registered was the screaming. It arrived a full 2 seconds after the charge. The crowd's nervous systems catching up with events, the high-end social composure of Manhattan's criminal and political elite dissolving in the same animal second as everyone else's. Crystal crashed somewhere to her left. She heard a woman's voice go up an octave, and then another, and then the sound compounded, became its own weather system, became the room's new atmosphere. She kept moving. Roman had his hand at the small of her back, and she stayed inside that pressure, using it as orientation the way you'd use a wall in the dark. They were moving toward a set of service doors she knew were there. She'd been in this building before, had walked these floors 6 weeks ago with a security consultant's checklist in her head, and her memory for spatial information was precise enough to be useful right now, even as her pulse climbed. Left, she said. He adjusted left without questioning it. The service door was unlocked. She'd noted it on the walk-in, a maintenance oversight, the kind of thing that bothered her professionally and now probably saved them 3 critical seconds. Roman pushed through first, arm extending back to bring her through, and then they were in the corridor behind the ballroom, fluorescent and gray and shockingly quiet, the noise of the main hall muffled to something distant and wrong. He turned to her immediately, not out of breath. His breathing was controlled in a way that told her it was deliberately controlled, that he'd consciously decided not to let his body do what bodies wanted to do right now. How many? He said. At least 2 positions. The balcony, which we identified, and someone in the ballroom itself. The woman in green wasn't watching the man by the pillar as a coincidence. They were a coordinated pair. Describe her again. Green dress, floor length, structured bodice, auburn hair, not natural, approximately 5'7". She was positioned at 11 o'clock relative to the orchestra for at least 40 minutes without moving toward the bar or any social cluster. She was working. Roman's jaw was set. He was already on his phone, not calling, texting, with the speed of someone whose thumb knew the contacts without looking. 2 of my people are already moving on the balcony access. The woman in green is either down or gone. He paused. If she's gone, she's a spotter. She's already reported, and the next move isn't hers. Then the next move comes from outside, Seraphina said. The exits. He looked at her. If this is pool, she said, and the charge was disorientation rather than destruction, then the goal isn't to kill you here. Too many witnesses, too much blowback, too much political exposure. The goal is to flush you out, to create a reason for you to move, to change your location, use a specific exit, get into a vehicle on their timeline rather than yours. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above them. Somewhere in the ballroom, someone was on a microphone, doing crowd management, and she could hear the particular cadence of professional calm being deployed on a room full of frightened people. Roman stared at her for 1 full second. Not in surprise, exactly. More in the way you look at something when it confirms a thing you'd already suspected, and the confirmation lands harder than you'd expected. Which exit are they covering? He said. All of them, she said. But the primary vehicle access is the south entrance. That's where your cars came in. That's where any reasonable assumption about your exit route would put you. She paused. We should leave through the north service access, kitchen egress. There's a freight loading bay on the 42nd Street side. He was already typing. 3 minutes passed. She stood in the corridor and regulated her own breathing and listened to the muffled chaos of the ballroom and thought about the man who had approached her. Vasquez, Roman had called him, and thought about the 14 months of financial intelligence operations Roman had mentioned, and thought about the fact that she had walked into this building 3 hours ago with no plan, no preparation, and nothing except a silver-black dress and a phone call she'd made on pure instinct. She thought about whether that instinct had been correct. She did not reach a conclusion, not yet. Roman's phone lit up. He read the screen. The balcony access was a sniper position. My people got there before he had a firing solution. He's contained. A pause, and something moved across his face briefly. Relief, she thought, though it passed so quickly she couldn't be certain. The woman in green slipped the ballroom at the time of the charge. We have her on external cameras heading west on 43rd. Spotter, Seraphina said. Spotter, he confirmed. Then they know the primary attempt failed, which means whoever is waiting at the south entrance doesn't know yet, he finished. We have a window, narrow. He looked at her in a way that she was beginning to learn, the specific quality of attention he brought to a decision point, the way he assembled information before moving, the way he did not move without assembling it. She'd seen Elias Mercer make decisions. Elias made decisions the way you swatted flies, reflexively, impatiently, with confidence born from the fact that he'd always had people like her to clean up the consequences. Roman Castellano made decisions the way a surgeon made incisions, deliberately, with full awareness of what was underneath. North Service exit, he said. They moved. Oh. The kitchen was chaos of a different kind. The organized professional panic of a culinary staff caught between their service obligations and the sound of what had happened 40 feet away. A sous chef was shouting into a phone. Someone was trying to stop a busboy from going through the service door into the ballroom. And a woman in a catering manager's vest was standing in the center of the room with both hands on her head and the specific expression of someone doing mental triage on a scale she had not trained for. Roman moved through it like he wasn't there. Not pushing, not aggressive, simply certain of his path, which was its own form of authority. People moved around him the way water moves around a stone, unconscious, automatic. Seraphina followed him through a second set of doors and down a concrete stairwell and through a fire door that Roman's man, a compact, dark-haired figure who had materialized at the bottom of the stairs in a way that suggested he'd been positioned there earlier, which meant earlier preparation, which meant Roman had known this evening was higher risk than a normal social event, held open without a word. The freight bay was cold and smelled of wet concrete and diesel. 3 vehicles were there, but not the armored black SUVs from earlier. These were a white panel van that had catering livery on the side and 2 unremarkable sedans, exactly the kind of vehicles that did not announce the presence of anyone worth following. The SUVs? She asked. Still at the south entrance, Roman said. He was buttoning his jacket against the cold, unhurried, the way a man is unhurried when urgency is no longer useful. If anyone is watching the south exit, they're watching the SUVs. She understood. They'll wait. For approximately 20 minutes before whoever is running this operation adjusts his strategy. He gestured to the nearer sedan. We're not waiting 20 minutes. She got in. The driver was a woman, which Seraphina had not expected, though she was not sure why she should have been surprised. 30s, short dark hair, a face that had been trained into stillness. She didn't speak. She drove with precise, unhurried efficiency through the back streets of Midtown, taking turns that weren't the obvious turns, and within 8 minutes they were moving north on a route that Seraphina, even with her considerable familiarity with the city's grid, would have had to think twice to map. Roman sat beside her in the back. The tension of the last 20 minutes was settling in the car, metabolizing into something different. The post-adrenaline weight that arrived after you'd been running on instinct and stopped needing to. Her shoulders ached. She hadn't noticed them clenching, but they had been. She became aware, sitting here in the dark and the motion of the car, that she had just been in a room where someone had tried to kill the man beside her, that she had identified the approach vector before his own security team, that she was in an unmarked car at, she checked her phone, 11:47 at night, wearing a silver-black dress that had been sitting in her closet for 8 months, having walked out of both a relationship and a job in the same evening. She sat with all of that. You should know, she said, that I'm not frightened. I know, Roman said. I'm pointing it out because I think it would be reasonable to be frightened, and the fact that I'm not is information about me that you should probably have. He turned to look at her. In the ambient light of the moving city through the car windows, his face was mostly shadow and edge. What do you think it means? I think it means I've been managing risk for 3 years, she said. What happened tonight was dangerous, but it wasn't unfamiliar in its structure. I've been navigating threat environments, less dramatic ones, but structurally similar, every day for 3 years. My nervous system isn't surprised by them. It's been rehearsing for them. He was quiet for a moment. That's one interpretation, he said. What's the other one? That you're in shock and the fear is delayed. A pause. Or that the decision you made tonight, the one you made before any of this, when you picked up your phone, was significant enough that it changed your risk horizon, and your body knows it. She thought about that. Possibly all three, she said. Something that was almost a sound of amusement came from him. Not a laugh. Nothing as relaxed as a laugh. Just an acknowledgement that he'd found something worth acknowledging. Where are we going? She asked. My building. Uptown. We need to be somewhere secure while my people finalize the situation at the Aldrich. Then I need to make several calls, and after that, he paused, as if deciding whether to continue. There are things I should tell you, given tonight. Given that someone tried to kill you and I helped stop it. Given that you came to a gala with me, identified 2 operational positions, declined a recruitment approach from a hostile intelligence asset, and navigated a threat extraction without losing your composure or your shoes. He looked at her. You're owed a complete picture. She held that. Yes, she said, I am. His building was what she expected and slightly more. The upper floors of a Riverside Drive address that had been purchased through 4 layers of shell company. She'd known that from Elias's research, which she'd conducted, which meant she'd known the address too, which was information she filed away without comment. The lobby was understated intentionally. The security was not. 3 men in the lobby. She counted them automatically. Positions, sightlines, hardware, under the jacket of the one nearest the elevator. She was getting tired. The adrenaline was fully metabolizing now, leaving behind a specific kind of fatigue that lived in the soft tissue behind her eyes and the base of her neck. But she was not tired enough to stop cataloging. The elevator was keyed. The apartment was the top 2 floors. She stepped inside it and stood in the space and registered. High ceilings, books on 2 walls, the city visible through glass on the 3rd, a kitchen that showed signs of actual use which surprised her. A grand piano in the far corner of the main room, a cello case beside it, which surprised her more. The furniture was older than she'd expected, not antique, not performatively so, but lived in. A leather sofa that had been sat in for years, a coffee table with 3 books splayed open on it, spines up, which meant he read 3 things simultaneously, which was a specific type of mind. Roman came in behind her and said something brief to the man who had taken a position near the door, who nodded and left. Then it was just the 2 of them. He took off his jacket. There was blood on his shirt collar. From the gala, the charge. She wasn't sure. She hadn't seen him get hit. And he touched the spot with 2 fingers, looked at his fingers, made a brief expression of acknowledgement, and moved toward the kitchen. Drink, he said. Not a question, the way he didn't make most things questions. Water. He brought her water and poured himself 2 fingers of something amber. He didn't drink it immediately. He stood at the counter and looked at the city through the kitchen window, and she sat on the edge of the leather sofa, both of them in the specific silence of people who have just come through something and are now locating themselves on the other side of it. His phone rang. He answered it. Moved to the far side of the room. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he listened more than he spoke. A single question here, a direction there, nothing that gave her the full picture but enough to understand the pieces. The Aldrich was secure, the sniper was in custody, the woman in green had been located and was being dealt with. Aldrich Pool's people were withdrawing from the East Corridor. Something about a secondary position on 44th Street that had stood down. He came back to the counter. The immediate situation is contained, he said. Pool? We'll make another move. Not tonight. He finally drank. He's patient. That's the problem. She turned her water glass in her hands. You said you'd give me the complete picture. He sat down then, not across from her but nearby, same sofa. A distance that was respectful and slightly less than she'd expected, which she noted. And he looked at her with that specific attention, the kind that had no performance in it. Aldrich Pool ran the financial intelligence division of a private security consortium for 11 years, he said. 3 years ago, he went independent. He runs a boutique operation, 20, maybe 25 people, that does one thing. He identifies individuals with access to high-value organizational intelligence, and he turns them. Or he attempts to. He targets people in positions like mine, she said. Like yours, yes. Executive adjacency, close to power, structurally necessary, but he paused, choosing the word. Invisible enough to be underseen. People who know the architecture of an organization because they built half of it, who've never been given acknowledgement proportionate to their contribution, who have grievances. He looked at her. He would have approached you tonight regardless of how you'd arrived. He would have approached me because I'm a disgruntled former employee with 3 years of Elias Mercer's operational exposure in my head. Yes. And you brought me to that gala knowing he'd be there. Yes. No deflection in it. She breathed. Did you bring me there to flush him out? The question sat between them. This was the question. She'd been carrying it since the kitchen corridor, since she'd walked away from Vasquez, since she'd registered the pattern of it in the car. She needed him to answer it the way she needed the answer itself. Directly, without management. Roman was quiet for a moment that was long enough to feel deliberate rather than hesitant. I brought you there, so, he said, because you called me. And I wanted you there. Because I've watched you for 2 years and because what Elias Mercer did to you tonight was... He stopped and something moved across his face that wasn't anger but was in the category of it. A waste. An extraordinary waste. And because, yes, I knew Poole's people were running assets in that room and I expected one of them to move toward you. And you wanted to see what I'd do. I wanted to see what you'd do, he confirmed. I'm telling you that directly because you asked directly, and because I'm not in the business of constructing comfortable narratives. He met her eyes. But I want to be clear about the sequence. I wanted you there first. The intelligence value of your response to Poole's approach was secondary. That's the honest account. She sat with it. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was the kind of honesty that didn't flatter either of them. Him for the admission, her for the fact that she'd walked into it with her eyes only partially open. And yet she found, turning it in her mind, that she preferred it to almost anything Elias Mercer had told her in 3 years because it was real, because it had weight, because it asked something of her rather than demanding she absorb it quietly and say nothing. If I'd taken Vasquez up on his offer, she said, you wouldn't have. How could you know that? Because of the 2 occasions where you had leverage over Elias and didn't use it. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. The first was the Whitmore Fund discrepancy. You had documentation of his direct involvement. You cleaned it up, you kept the documentation, and you filed it somewhere he couldn't access it. Not as a weapon, as a record. She went very still. How do you know that? She said. Because I have one of the best information networks in North America, he said simply. And because I've been watching your work for 2 years, I told you that. You know about the Whitmore file. I know you have it, I don't have it. I'm not asking for it. His voice was even. Careful with the distinction. I'm telling you what I know so that you understand the level of attention I've been paying so that this conversation doesn't have false floors. She stood up. Not dramatically, just the need to be vertical, to reorganize herself in space. She walked to the window and looked at the city and was quiet for a moment. 3 years. He'd been watching for 3 years, and she'd been inside Elias Mercer's world with no idea. She'd been performing loyalty to the wrong person while the right kind of attention had been present the entire time, just outside the circle of her awareness. There was something both clarifying and deeply unsettling about that. The Whitmore file, she said to the window, is in a safe deposit box in a bank I won't name. It documents 4 instances of Elias Mercer directing funds from a legitimate portfolio into operations that I believe are connected to at least 2 of the families you sat across from at the Belladonna tonight. Roman said nothing. I kept it, she said, because I didn't know what else to do with it. I wasn't ready to use it against him and I wasn't capable of pretending I didn't know what it meant. So I kept it. The way you keep a loaded weapon, you're not sure you have the right to carry. She turned around. Roman was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual. She was good at reading expressions, and his were more controlled than most. But there was something in this one that was close enough to the surface that she caught the edge of it. She thought it might have been the closest thing to moved that a man like him was capable of looking. The file, he said, is potentially significant. I know. Not to me. To the broader situation, depending on what operations those funds connected to. A pause. It's also potentially dangerous for you to hold. I know that too. He stood. He was across the room from her, and the distance felt suddenly specific. She was aware of it in a way that had nothing to do with threat assessment, which was a different kind of awareness, one she hadn't expected to arrive tonight on top of everything else. "I want to offer you a position," he said, formally. "What I said at the gala, in front of the room, that wasn't performance. I meant it. I want you as my chief strategist, advisory and operational both. I want your mind on the architecture of my organization's financial structure, and I want your judgment in the room when I'm making decisions." She looked at him. "That's the professional offer," he said. "I'm making it now clearly, so there's no ambiguity about what I'm asking and what I'm not asking." "And the rest of it?" she said. A pause. "The rest of it," he said, "is something I'm going to let exist as itself for the moment, without trying to name it, because I think you've had enough decisions to make in one evening, and I'm not willing to manufacture pressure." She looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching, without softening, without adding anything. He'd said what he'd said, and he was letting it be what it was. "You know that Elias will come after this," she said. "Once he understands what my working with you actually means, the Whitmore file, the operational knowledge I carry, he won't just be embarrassed, he'll be threatened." "Yes. And Poole isn't done. Poole is never done until he's stopped. And you want me inside all of that?" "I want you exactly where you are," Roman said, "standing in the middle of it, with full information, making your own decisions. Not beside me as a strategy, as yourself." She thought about the penthouse, the folder on the console, the man adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. She thought about too soft and useful, past tense and predictable. She thought about the moment in the corridor at the Aldrich when she'd said, "upper left balcony, third door from the corner," and he'd looked at her not like she'd surprised him, but like she'd confirmed something he'd been waiting to hear, confirmed. "I'll take the position," she said. Something in the room shifted, not dramatically, just the particular shift of an important thing being decided. "Good," he said, simple, complete. Her phone vibrated. She looked down at it, expecting, she wasn't sure what. Something operational. Something from Roman's people, perhaps, since they had her number now. It was Elias. Not a call. A text. 4 words, which was exactly 4 more words than she'd expected to hear from him tonight. "We need to talk." She stared at the screen. Then, 2 seconds later, a second message arrived. This one longer. This one with a specific name in it. A name she recognized. A name she had not expected to see. A name that meant the situation she'd walked into tonight was considerably more complicated than she'd understood. A name that told her Elias Mercer had not been as oblivious as he'd seemed. A name that suggested he'd known something about Roman Castellano's interest in her, and had kept that knowledge, and was now ready to use it. She looked up. Roman was watching her face. "What is it?" he said. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. She watched him read it. And for the first time all evening, Roman Castellano's expression shifted into something that was not composure, not control, not the deliberate stillness of a man managing his own reactions. It was something older, something that had a history in it. "He knows her," Roman said. Not to Seraphina, to himself, or to the wall, or to whatever private accounting he was running in the back of his mind where she could not follow. "Who is she?" Seraphina asked. Roman set down his glass. He moved to the window. He stood with his back to her, shoulder set, looking at the same city she'd been looking at, and the silence stretched until it had weight and texture and edges. Then he said a name, and Seraphina understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific recognition of a situation that has no clean exit, that the woman whose name Roman had just spoken was the reason this entire evening had happened. Not Elias's cruelty. Not Poole's operation. Not even her own phone call, made in the raw quiet of a discarded night. All of it, every piece of tonight, pointed back to one woman. And Seraphina was only now beginning to understand that she'd been standing at the center of something much older than herself, and the center was about to collapse. Her name was Mara Voss. Seraphina said it aloud once, quietly, to hear what it sounded like in the room. And it sounded like nothing she recognized, which meant she was already behind. Roman was still at the window. He hadn't moved since he'd said the name. His back was to her, and his shoulders were doing the thing she'd noticed earlier. Not tense, exactly, but held, The way a man holds himself when he's decided that his body is not going to be allowed to tell the truth about what's happening inside it. The city was still out there beyond the glass. Traffic below, amber and moving. The Hudson invisible in the dark. She gave him 12 seconds. Then, "Tell me who she is." He turned around. His face was back under control. She could see the seams of it, could see the effort, which was something she doubted most people ever saw because most people weren't watching for it. But she was watching, and the effort was there. Mara Voss, he said, was my father's financial architect for 11 years. She built the accounting structure that turned a street-level operation into something that could move through legitimate markets. She was, a pause, brief, surgical, extraordinary at what she did. Was. She left the organization 8 years ago, after my father's stroke, before I took over. He moved away from the window. Not toward her, toward the kitchen counter, toward the drink he'd abandoned, toward something to do with his hands. The official account was that she'd built what she came to build and was moving on. Her contract terms were met. There was a severance arrangement. And the actual account. He picked up the glass, put it down without drinking. She and my father had an arrangement that went beyond the professional. When he had the stroke, when it became clear he wasn't recovering, she was... He stopped, chose the next words with precision, in a position she hadn't anticipated. She had expected to inherit certain protections, certain guarantees. My father had made commitments to her that he hadn't documented, and when I took over, those commitments weren't in any file I was given. Seraphina sat down. Not because she was tired. She was tired. Her feet were starting to register the hours in heels, but that wasn't why she sat. She sat because she was processing, and she processed better with her weight settled. She came to you, she said, when you took over. She came to me, Kern, he confirmed. And she made her case, and I looked at what she was presenting. Verbal commitments, no documentation, a claim to ongoing financial arrangements that my father had allegedly promised. And I made a decision. He looked at her directly. I honored the contractual severance. I did not honor the unverified informal arrangements, because I had no way to verify them, and because the organization was in a transitional period, and because I was 33 years old and had just taken over a structure larger than anything I'd managed before, and I did not have another pause. I did not handle it with sufficient care. The last sentence landed differently from the others. It cost him something. She heard it cost him. She felt cheated, Seraphina said. She felt abandoned, he said, which is different, and she wasn't wrong that she'd been left in an untenable position. She was wrong about some of what she claimed, but she wasn't entirely wrong. He moved to the sofa, not beside her, the chair across, and sat in a way that suggested he was done standing. She spent the following 3 years building an independent intelligence operation, not pools, separate from pool. She has her own network, smaller, more specific, focused almost entirely on my organization and my family's history. She's been running intelligence against you for 3 years. 5 now. She expanded after the first 2. He rested his elbows on his knees, looked at the middle distance. She's the one who turned 3 of my mid-tier financial managers in the first year. She's the one who fed information to the Farrugia brothers that nearly collapsed the Baltimore shipping arrangement 2 years ago. And she is... He looked up. The reason Aldrich Poole has been able to operate my financial architecture as effectively as he has. Seraphina understood then, the structure of it, the way the pieces connected. She's his source. She's been his source for 18 months. Poole provides the operational capacity. She provides the institutional knowledge. He looked at the phone still in Seraphina's hand. And now Elias Mercer has her name. How? That's the question I'm currently unable to answer. His voice had dropped to something quieter, and in the quiet she heard the thing underneath the control, the thing the composure was covering. Genuine unease, not fear, but the category of thing adjacent to fear, the thing that lives in the gap between a prepared man and the surprise he didn't prepare for. Elias shouldn't have access to her. There's no legitimate path between his operation and hers. If he has her name and is sending it to you, He's sending it to you, she said. Through me. He knows I'm with you. Yes. Which means he wants you to know that he has that connection. He's not threatening you with information. He's signaling that he's made a contact. Roman was quiet. He approached her, Seraphina said, or she approached him. Tonight, after the gala, after he saw the two of us together and understood what it meant, she was working through it as she spoke, the logic assembling itself. He understood that I'm not just a discarded employee anymore. I'm inside your organization. I carry 3 years of his operational exposure, and now I'm potentially positioned to use it. He needed a counterweight. She paused. He found Mara Voss in the last 3 hours, she said. That's not possible, Roman said. You said yourself she's been building for 5 years. She doesn't wait to be found. She would have had a contact protocol embedded in Elias's world long before tonight. She looked at him. Did she ever approach Elias directly? The silence that followed was 2 seconds long. In those 2 seconds, she watched Roman Castellano arrive at an answer he didn't want to arrive at. 18 months ago, he said, Elias attempted to formalize a relationship with my organization through intermediaries. The approach was clumsy. He was essentially offering political cover in exchange for a seat at certain tables. I declined through the same intermediaries. But Mara would have seen the approach. She would have seen it before I did, he said. If she's embedded in my intake channels, which she is to some degree, she would have made a separate contact with Elias at that point, Seraphina said. Without your knowledge. She planted herself in his world 18 months ago as an insurance policy. And tonight, when he needed her, she held up the phone. She was already there. Roman stood up, not dramatically, just the body's response to a mind that had decided it needed to move. He crossed to the window again and then turned back, and the expression on his face was different now from anything she'd seen. It was the expression of a man whose map has just been revealed to be wrong. Not lost, exactly, but aware that the coordinates he'd been navigating by don't match the terrain. She knows about you, he said. She'd have seen the approach to Elias. She knows you were his executive officer. She knows what you carry. He looked at her with something that was close to urgency, which was close to the most unguarded she'd seen him. She'll know by now that you're here. What does that mean for tonight? It means the situation at the Aldrich was one thing, he said. Pool's operation. Containable, as it turned out. But Mara is not Pool. Pool wants leverage. Mara wants... He stopped. What does she want? Seraphina said. The pause was long enough that she nearly asked again. Everything I have, he said. Everything my father promised her and didn't put in writing. Everything she believes she was owed. She's not building leverage. She's building a case for replacement. He said it with a flatness that told her the word replacement carried more weight in his world than its surface definition suggested. She understood. She wants control of the organization. She wants what she considers to be hers. He looked at the phone again. And tonight, Elias Mercer just handed her the most useful thing she's had in 5 years. Me, Seraphina said. Her name, spoken into the operative infrastructure of what Mara Voss had spent 5 years building. That was the damage. Not the sniper at the Aldrich, not Vasquez in the Green Gallery. Those were moves in a game whose parameters she'd been able to understand, assess, respond to. This was different. This was the discovery that the game had a second board she hadn't seen, and the pieces on it had been positioned before she'd ever sat down. She needed to think. She asked Roman for 20 minutes, and a room that wasn't this one, and he gave her both. A study off the main hallway, smaller, walls of books on 2 sides, a desk with nothing on it, which she preferred because a desk with things on it was a desk that belonged to someone else's work. She sat. She had her phone and her mind and 3 years of institutional knowledge, which was everything and possibly not enough. The Whitmore file. She kept coming back to it. Roman had said it was significant, potentially significant, and the word potentially had been doing the work of something larger. If the funds in the Whitmore discrepancy connected to operations that touched Mara Voss's history, then the file wasn't merely documentation of Elias's exposure. It was a thread that ran through the entire architecture of what had happened in the last 5 years, connecting Roman's father, Mara's departure, Elias's ambitions, Pool's operation, all of it. She needed to know what those funds had actually been used for. She hadn't asked that question, She had identified the discrepancy, documented it, contained it, and filed it away because asking the deeper question had felt, at the time, like a door she wasn't certain she wanted to open. She'd been inside Elias's operation. She'd had survival instincts calibrated to a particular environment, and in that environment, the instinct had been know enough to protect yourself, not enough to implicate yourself. That calibration was now wrong for the situation she was in. She spent 18 minutes reconstructing everything she knew about the Whitmore discrepancy from memory, layering it against what Roman had just told her about Maravos's timeline, looking for the point of intersection. She found it. It arrived not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. The specific feeling of a memory you've stored in the wrong category suddenly appearing in the right one. The third Whitmore transaction, 14 months ago. She'd flagged it as an anomaly in Elias's real estate portfolio, traced it to a series of shell transfers, lost the thread at the fourth layer because the fourth layer had been cleaned too well for her tools. She'd documented the discrepancy without the destination and filed it as unresolved. 14 months ago. Pool's operation had been running for 14 months, by Roman's account. The funds hadn't gone to Elias's real estate portfolio. They'd been moved sideways through a series of structures she'd identified but not fully mapped, and she was now almost certain they'd been used to capitalize something. An operation. Specifically, the kind of operation that required initial funding before it could self-sustain. Elias had partially funded Pool's operation against Roman's organization. She sat with that for a moment that felt longer than it was. Elias hadn't been clumsy. He'd been building. For 18 months, at the same time he'd been pursuing a formal relationship with Roman through intermediaries, he'd been funding the woman who was running intelligence against Roman through other channels. He'd been placing bets on both outcomes simultaneously, covering exposure in both directions, the way you covered a short position while holding the long, which was exactly the kind of financial thinking Elias Mercer was actually good at. When the stakes were high enough for him to be honest about his nature, she stood up. She needed to tell Roman. She also needed to understand what telling Roman would mean. She was 3 hours into working for this man. She was sitting in his building with his blood on the collar of a dress she'd bought for herself, having come from the ruins of 3 years with a man who'd just revealed himself to be actively hostile to the man she was now working for. And she was about to hand Roman Castellano information that would simultaneously prove her value and destroy any possibility of neutrality. She was about to become, fully and irrevocably, a participant in something that had been happening without her for a long time. She thought about neutral. She thought about the folder on Elias's console. Neutral had never been real. She'd been inside it all along. She'd just been the only person in the room who believed she wasn't. She opened the study door. Though Roman was on the phone when she came back in. 2 calls had happened in the 20 minutes she'd been gone, she gathered. The energy of the room was different, sharper, and the man who'd been at the front door was back, standing near the entrance with the particular stillness of someone on an elevated alert level. Roman saw her face and ended his call in 2 words. She told him. She gave it to him the way she gave everything, precisely, sequentially, without editorializing except where the editorial was necessary for context. The Whitmore third transaction, the 14-month timeline, the shell structure, the probable destination. She watched his face while she talked. He was very still, not the chosen stillness of earlier, a different kind, the stillness of a man who is absorbing something that requires all available processing capacity. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You're certain," he said, "about the funding structure, yes. About the ultimate destination, 85%. I lost the thread at the 4th shell layer, but the timeline and the capital requirement are consistent, and Elias's motive is is clear," Roman said. Yes, he stood. He was hedging against his own approach to my organization. If the formal relationship worked, he was positioned as a potential ally. If it failed, he had an intelligence operation already inside my structure that he could activate or sell. He's been running both strategies simultaneously for 18 months. And tonight I gave him a reason to activate the second one. Roman's voice was even, but she heard something in it. The specific register of a man working to stay ahead of an anger he's decided isn't useful right now. By taking you from him publicly, by making it visible. He didn't just lose an employee, she said. He lost an asset he hadn't declared, and gained a direct line to Mara Voss through the contact she'd already established. He moved. The apartment felt smaller when he moved through it with intent. She was becoming aware of his physical scale in moments of directed energy, the way the room rearranged itself around him. I need to make 2 calls. Then we need to move. Where? There's a secondary location, safer than here for the next several hours while I get my people consolidated. He was already moving toward the bedroom. She heard a drawer, the sound of something being retrieved, the efficient sounds of preparation. He came back out in 40 seconds, jacket gone, a different one in hand, something in his inside pocket that she didn't ask about. He stopped. "The Whitmore file," he said. "Can you access it tonight?" "The bank isn't open." "Can you access it tonight?" he repeated. She understood. "You have someone at the bank." "I have several someones at several banks. The question is whether you're willing to pull the file now, tonight, and put it in play." She understood what that meant. The file in play meant it was no longer just documentation she was holding as a private record. It became evidence, weapon, whichever it needed to be, at Roman's discretion, in a conflict that was now moving faster than she'd anticipated. "If I pull the file tonight," she said, "Elias has no more leverage." "Correct. And no incentive to hold back." "He has no incentive to hold back now," Roman said. "He made the Mara Voss move in the last 3 hours. He's not holding anything." She thought about it for exactly as long as thinking was useful. "Pull the file," she said. Mafia. The car this time was different. Not the sedan, not the white van, but a single black car with a driver she recognized from the Aldrich kitchen, the woman with dark hair and the still face. Roman sat in front, Seraphina in the back, alone, which meant he was on a call she wasn't meant to hear. She sat in the dark of the moving car, and she was aware that she was no longer in any version of the life she'd woken up in this morning. That was true in the obvious sense, the job, the apartment she'd shared pieces of her time with Elias's world, the particular routines of 3 years. But it was also true in a deeper sense that she was still locating. She had crossed something tonight, and the crossing was complete, and there was no going back across it, not because of Roman's offer or the Whitmore file, or any of the external mechanics of the evening, but because of something internal that had shifted when she'd stood in Elias's penthouse and felt the absence of surprise. She had known. Some part of her had known for a long time that the structure she was maintaining wasn't the structure she was supposed to be inside. She'd been managing someone else's empire, absorbing someone else's crises, folding herself into origami shapes that fit inside his shadow. She'd called it loyalty. She'd called it love, at the beginning. Later she'd called it investment, sunk cost, the reasonable conclusion of 3 years of involvement. She'd called it a lot of things, and none of them had been accurate, because accurate would have been, I stayed because leaving required a destination, and I didn't have one. She had one now. The thought arrived without ceremony. She sat with it in the dark of the moving car and let it be what it was. Her phone vibrated. Not Elias this time. A number she didn't recognize. Clean, no area code artifacts, the kind of number that had been constructed rather than assigned. She answered it because not answering it seemed worse. "Ms. Vale." The voice was a woman's. Low, precise, with an accent she couldn't place immediately. Somewhere mid-European, possibly, or constructed to suggest mid-European, cultured, careful. The voice of someone who'd spent time learning to sound like whatever the room required. "Yes," Seraphina said. "My name is Mara Voss." The car was still moving. Outside the windows, the city was night traffic and wet streets and the particular loneliness of Manhattan past midnight. Seraphina did not make a sound. She let the name sit. "I'm going to assume," Mara said, "that he's told you about me by now. Roman is many things, but he's not careless with information when he's trying to build trust. He would have told you." "He told me," Seraphina said. "Then you know the shape of this, and I'd like to speak with you. Not through intermediaries, not through whatever version of the situation Roman is presenting, directly. Before you make commitments, you can't undo." Seraphina kept her voice level. "I've already made them." "You've said yes to a job offer in a penthouse at midnight after a very dramatic evening," Mara said. "That's not the same as a commitment you can't undo. Those come later, when what he's asking you to do starts to look different in daylight. What are you offering? A brief pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Information. Specifically, information about why Roman Castellano was watching you for 2 years. Another pause. The story he told you about his father, about my departure, it's accurate as far as it goes. But there are things it doesn't include, things that are relevant to your specific situation. Tell me now, Seraphina said, not on an open line. Then we have nothing to talk about. Ms. Vale. The voice shifted fractionally, not softer, but more direct, the calculated warmth stripped away. He knew who you were before you called him tonight. He knew your name, your work, your institutional value. He told you he'd been watching for 2 years. Did he tell you why he never approached you in those 2 years? Why he waited for you to come to him? Seraphina said nothing. He waited, Mara said, because he needed you to be desperate. He needed you to have no other option. A capable woman with a stable position and a functioning life, she negotiates. She makes conditions. She maintains leverage. The voice was precise as a scalpel now. A woman who's just been discarded by the man she gave 3 years to, who's raw and unmoored and looking for a door, she walks through the one that opens. The car hit a pothole. Small jolt. The city moved past. He opened the door, Mara said, at exactly the right moment. Ask yourself whether that moment was coincidence. Seraphina had a response ready. She had the structural counter-argument assembled. The fact that Elias's timing was Elias's decision, not Roman's. That Roman couldn't have engineered the specific cruelty of tonight's dismissal. That the logic Mara was presenting had the shape of truth, but not the substance. She had all of that ready. And then she didn't say any of it. Because of a thing she'd noticed earlier and filed and not returned to. Roman, in the corridor at the Aldrich before they'd left the ballroom. She'd told him the balcony door, upper left, third from the corner. And he'd looked at her and said, completely certain, not as a question. And she'd thought at the time that it was a statement, a confirmation of her certainty. But she was replaying it now, and she was hearing it differently. He'd said completely certain the way you say something when you already know the answer. When you're not asking. When the question is rhetorical because you know what's behind the door and you want to see if she does. The balcony access. He'd had people moving on it before they'd left the ballroom. He'd said so in the corridor. 2 of my people are already moving on the balcony access. Before she'd identified it. She hadn't processed that at the time. She'd been in motion, and the mechanics of the extraction, and the timing had slipped past her. His people were already moving on the balcony before she'd identified the door. Which meant he'd known the balcony was in play before she'd told him, which meant her identification of the threat. The moment that had felt like proof of her operational value, the thing that had felt somewhere in her chest like being finally seen for what she was capable of, had been a confirmation, not a revelation. He'd already known. Ms. Vale, Mara said. I need you to stop talking, Seraphina said quietly. She needed to think. She needed 2 minutes of silence, and the car was still moving, and Mara Voss was on the phone, and Roman was in the front seat, and the car stopped. They'd arrived somewhere. She couldn't see clearly through the tinted glass, a garage underground, lit by pale fluorescence. The driver was already out. The front door opened, and Roman stepped out, and as he did, he glanced back through the window at her. A brief glance, checking, the kind of glance that was supposed to be casual, and saw the phone in her hand, saw her face, and in the quarter second before he controlled his expression, she saw it. Recognition. He knew who was on the phone. He knew she'd been called, which meant he'd known the call was coming, which meant the garage door behind them rolled shut. Roman opened her door. She looked up at him from the seat, and the question was on her face in full, unmanaged, and he met it without looking away, which was its own answer. And in the particular silence of that look, she understood that whatever she had believed this evening was, it was not entirely that. Get off the phone, he said. Quiet. Flat. She looked at him for a long moment. Mara, she said into the phone, without looking away from Roman. I'll call you back. She ended the call. The garage hummed around them, fluorescent, cold, sealed. You knew she'd call me, Seraphina said. Roman crouched to her eye level. He rested his forearms on the car door frame and looked at her with a directness that was, she recognized now, a practiced thing. The directness had always been real, but it had also always been deployed. "Yes," he said. The word arrived in her chest like a key turning in the wrong direction. "You knew the balcony position before I told you," she said. A pause. 2 seconds. "Yes." "You've been running me," she said. "Since the phone call. Since before the phone call." "Not running you," he said. "That's not—" "Don't," she said. And her voice was something she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. Stripped of the management, stripped of the professionalism and the composure and the 3 years of careful navigation. Just the thing underneath. "Don't tell me what word to use, tell me what you did." He was quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. "I knew Elias was going to end things with you tonight," he said. "I knew about the Alcott engagement. I've known for 6 weeks. I knew he'd dismiss you. I expected you to be—" Another pause, and this one cost him something she could see. "I expected you to be in a specific state when it happened. Accessible. Open to a conversation you would not have been open to otherwise." She heard everything in that sentence that was not the sentence. She heard the architecture of it. She heard 3 years of watching transformed into a calculation about the precise moment a capable woman could be approached. And the approach had been the phone call she'd made herself, which he'd answered within 2 rings, and the SUVs that had arrived in 47 minutes, and the arm he'd offered at the top of the steps. She heard Mara Voss's voice. "He needed you to be desperate." She sat in the car in the underground garage and she was aware of her own heartbeat. Not racing, not the adrenaline rhythm of earlier, but a slow, steady, fundamental rhythm, the rhythm of a body deciding what it's made of. She had been discarded by one man tonight who had called her too soft and predictable, and she had walked directly into the arms of a second man who had called her extraordinary and then built the circumstances to engineer her arrival. The difference between them was that Roman Castellano had looked at her with full attention and genuine regard. She didn't doubt that was real. She trusted her own ability to read it, and had also calculated how to position that regard for maximum effect. The feeling of being seen had been real. The architecture around it had been constructed. Both things were true. She stood up out of the car. She was taller than she felt. "I'm going to ask you one question," she said, standing in front of him in a fluorescent garage in the middle of the night in a silver-black dress. "And you're going to answer it completely. Not mostly. Completely." He straightened, met her eyes. "Ask it." "The Whitmore file," she said. "You already knew what was in it, didn't you?" The pause was 3 seconds. 3 seconds was, she had learned tonight, the specific duration of Roman Castellano arriving at a decision about how honest to be. "Yes," he said. Something in the room changed that wouldn't change back. "You knew about Elias's funding of Poole's operation," she said. "You knew before tonight, before the gala, before I told you. I had substantial intelligence about it, not the specific shell structure, not the 4th layer. What you identified in the study. I didn't have that specific path, but the broad shape of it, the funding, the connection. Yes." She thought about the moment in the study, the 18 minutes she'd spent reconstructing it, the sense of discovery, of contribution, of handing him something of value. She thought about how that had felt. "You let me believe I'd found something new," she said, "so that I'd be invested, so that I'd feel—" "What? Useful? Essential? So that you'd feel what you actually are," he said, and his voice had changed too. The composure was still there, but something honest had moved up beneath it, something that hadn't been visible before, something with an edge that wasn't performance. "Which is the most capable operational intelligence I've encountered in 10 years. The specific pathway you found, the 4th layer, I genuinely didn't have it. That part was real. Your reconstruction was—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She turned away from him. She needed to look at something that wasn't his face, which was the wall of the garage, gray concrete, fluorescent lit, indifferent. She put both hands flat against it and let the cold of the concrete come through her palms. She had made one phone call tonight out of pure instinct, raw hurt, and something that was possibly the first genuinely autonomous decision she'd made in 3 years. And that instinct had walked her directly into a situation that had been, in significant part, designed for her. The question was what she did with that. She could walk. The garage had exits. She had her phone, her wits, the Whitmore file in a safe deposit box at a bank address she hadn't told him. The full address she'd withheld even as she'd described the file's contents, because some part of her, some deeply structural, uncorruptible part, had kept one piece back. She could walk, or she could turn around. She thought about Mara Voss, who had spent 5 years building something on the foundation of a real grievance that had calcified into obsession. She thought about what genuine betrayal did to a person over time, how it curdled, how it organized itself into a purpose that crowded everything else out until the grievance was the person, until you couldn't find the human being under the mission anymore. She thought about Elias Mercer in his penthouse with his cufflinks, who had made calculations about her value for 3 years and never once told her the truth of any of them. She thought about Roman Castellano, who had made calculations about her and had also told her the truth of them when she'd asked directly, even when the truth cost him. Even tonight, even just now. She had asked directly, and he had answered directly, and she was standing in a garage at 1 a.m. with her hands on cold concrete trying to decide whether the honesty undid the calculation or whether they were, in fact, the same thing. She turned around. He was exactly where she'd left him. He hadn't moved toward her. He'd given her the wall. "If you lie to me again," she said, "by omission or by construction or by letting me believe something is a discovery when it isn't, any form of it, I will take the Whitmore file to the federal office on Worth Street and I will walk away from every piece of this." He looked at her. "I will burn everything," she said, "and I will walk away with nothing, because nothing is preferable to being managed by someone I trusted." "I understand," he said. "That's not a yes. I won't lie to you again," he said, "by any form of it." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring, weighing not just the words but the layer beneath, the register, the quality of commitment in it. "There's something else," he said. Before she could respond, his voice had changed entirely now. All the architecture down, the first time all evening she was hearing something that hadn't been filtered through calculation. "Something I haven't told you, because I didn't know how to tell it without it sounding like the kind of manipulation you just accused me of." She waited. "Mara Voss," he said, "the information she has, the reason she told you what she told you tonight, she's not just running an intelligence operation against my organization." He stopped, started again. "My father made her a specific promise," he said. "Not about money, not about financial arrangements, about you." The concrete wall was cold at her back. "About me," she repeated. "Not you specifically," he said. "About a type of person, about the kind of woman who would eventually—" He stopped, and she could see him working against something, some version of how this sounded, and giving up on it. He made her a promise about his successor's future, about who would sit beside whoever took over this organization. He'd made her believe that would be her, and then he had a stroke, and I took over, and she came to me claiming that promise. And I told her it was unverifiable and unenforceable, and I was 33 years old, and I made a decision that I thought was logical, and that was, in retrospect, the thing that set all of this in motion. Seraphina was very still. "And tonight," she said slowly, "you walked into a room with me on your arm, in front of everyone, and announced that I was taking the position of your chief strategist. Yes, which Mara Voss saw. She would have seen it within minutes. And she understood what it meant," Seraphina said. "She understood that you'd found someone, not an employee, not an alliance, someone you were placing publicly, the way his father placed her, the fulfillment of a promise made to someone else." Roman said nothing. He didn't need to. "She's not going to stop," Seraphina said. "No. She's going to come at me specifically now, not because I have operational value to you, because of what my position represents to her." "Yes." Seraphina breathed. The cold of the garage and the cold of the concrete and the long, cold weight of the evening settling fully into her bones. "Then we have a problem," she said, "that is considerably larger than pool and considerably more personal and is going to require me to do things I haven't decided yet if I'm capable of." "I know," he said. She looked at him in the fluorescent light. This man who had watched her for 2 years and calculated her arrival and told her the truth when the truth was the hardest available option, and was standing here now with blood on his collar and the full accounting of his deceptions laid open. She thought about soft. She thought about predictable. She thought about 3 years of folding herself small enough to fit inside someone else's shadow. She was done being that size. Then we should get to work, she said. And somewhere above the city, in an apartment whose address she'd never shared and a phone number registered to a name that wasn't hers, Mara Voss set down her phone, looked out at the same Manhattan skyline, and began to move her pieces into their final positions. The second location was a brownstone on the Upper West Side that didn't exist in any property record under Roman Castellano's name or anything connected to it. 4 floors, the top 2 converted into a secure operations space, the kind of conversion that had taken time and money and people who knew how to build things that looked like nothing from the outside. Seraphina walked in and immediately started mapping it. Exits. 3 visible, 1 probable 4th behind the kitchen wall by the sound the ventilation made. Sight lines from the street, limited by the brownstone setback and the mature trees along the sidewalk. Security, 2 men on the ground floor, one she could identify, one she couldn't, both with the particular stillness of professionals rather than hired muscle. Roman's people moved differently from Elias's people. Elias's people had performed readiness. Roman's people simply were it. She counted everything. She always counted everything. Tonight the habit felt less like professional diligence and more like survival. Roman was already on the phone before they reached the top of the stairs. She heard fragments. Consolidate the Aldrich. Perugia needs to hear from me directly before 6. Say, find out how she got the number. That last one. Find out how Mara Voss had gotten her personal number, which meant Mara's reach was broader than even Roman had mapped, which meant the 5 years of infrastructure building had penetrated something closer to the center than anyone had acknowledged. She stood in the operations room, 2 long tables, screens on the far wall showing feeds she couldn't fully read from this distance. Maps. The particular organized density of a space where multiple people worked quickly. And she made herself feel the tiredness. She did this sometimes when she needed to think clearly, made herself feel the thing she'd been suppressing rather than continuing to suppress it. Her feet hurt. The dress, beautiful as it was not built for what the evening had required of it. There was a dull ache behind her sternum that was probably adrenaline residue and possibly something more personal that she wasn't ready to name. She was tired in the specific way you get tired when your nervous system has been running at capacity for too many consecutive hours. She let herself feel all of it. Then she set it aside. She went to the nearer table and found a legal pad. There was always a legal pad somewhere. In every operational space, it was one of the constants of professional life that she found oddly comforting. And she sat down and she began to write. Not everything, just the architecture. The points of intersection between what she knew and what she'd been told and what she'd inferred, laid out in the spatial logic that worked best for her mind. A kind of map with arrows and brackets and the specific notation system she'd developed over 3 years of managing Elias's exposure and never showed anyone. She wrote for 11 minutes. When Roman came back, she turned the pad toward him. He looked at it for a long moment. She watched his eyes move across it the way she'd watched him read the room at the Aldrich, with the specific focused quality of a mind that processed spatial information efficiently. The 4th shell layer, he said. He was pointing at a notation in the lower right quadrant. It terminates at a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, under a name I only know from one other document in my experience, she said. An incorporation filing I processed for Elias 14 months ago that I thought was a routine real estate vehicle. It's not a real estate vehicle. What is it? It's the capitalization structure of a media company, she said. A small one. A digital publication that covers organized crime. Investigative journalism framing, but the editorial direction is, she paused, targeted. It's been running targeted coverage of your organization for 13 months. Nothing that could be prosecuted as defamation, but precisely calibrated to create specific impressions in specific audiences. Roman was very still. Elias has been running a media operation against you, she said. Not just intelligence through pool, public narrative. Slow pressure on your reputation through a publication that looks independent. The Meridian Report, he said. She looked at him. I know the publication, he said. I didn't know its ownership structure. He straightened. I need that incorporation filing. It's in the same safe deposit box as the Whitmore documents. She met his eyes. I kept everything. Something crossed his face that she chose not to analyze. When does the bank open? 8 o'clock. He looked at the clock on the wall. 3:47 in the morning. He made a sound that was not quite a word and moved to the window. 4 hours and 13 minutes. A lot could happen in 4 hours and 13 minutes. But it happened in one. The first call came at 4:52. One of Roman's people, says he, the woman who'd driven them, whose name Seraphina had not yet been given, appeared in the doorway of the operations room and said two words that compressed every muscle in the room into a different configuration. She moved. Roman was at the table in 3 steps. The screens on the far wall were cycling through feeds. She could see them now, a grid of 8 or 9 views, some exterior cameras, some interior, one she didn't recognize that showed a building lobby in a part of the city she couldn't immediately place. Which asset? Roman said. Elias Mercer's building. She went in 40 minutes ago, through the service entrance. The driver, she had a name now, Roman used it, Petra, was reading from a tablet, precise and fast. We had a camera on the building because of your earlier assessment of the Mercer situation. She used a keycard, his keycard by the access log. He let her in. Roman turned to look at Seraphina. She understood what that meant. Mara Voss was in Elias Mercer's building, admitted by Elias 40 minutes ago at 4 in the morning. They've been in contact longer than tonight, she said. How much longer? Roman said, not to her, to Petra. We're pulling communications now. Early read is at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 2 weeks before the Belladonna Gala. 1 week before Elias had made his announcement. While Seraphina had been in that office, managing his accounts, covering his exposure, preparing the quarterly projections, while all of that had been happening, Elias had been in a 3-week conversation with the woman who was running a 5-year campaign against the man Seraphina was now sitting across a table from at 5 in the morning. He knew I'd end up here, she said. Roman looked at her. He knew before tonight. He knew you'd been watching me, or he suspected that I'd be valuable to you, and he started building the Mara Voss connection as a preemptive move. She could hear herself working through it, could hear the precision of it assembling. He planned to discard me, but he also planned to use your departure as the mechanism, Roman said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Colder. Something that was past anger into the territory beyond, where things got decided. Send you to me. Ensure you were carrying the right information. The Whitmore file, the shell structure, the incorporation filing, he knew you had those. He's been counting on you to bring them here. The room was very quiet. He wanted me to hand you information that would destabilize you, she said, that would force a response, force you to expose your resources, your contacts, your response patterns. She stopped. And Mara is inside his building right now, which means they're watching, Petra said from the doorway. If we move on the bank at 8, if we move at all in the next 12 hours, they'll know exactly how we're responding and why. The operations room held its silence. Seraphina turned the legal pad over. What if we move before 8, she said. Every head in the room turned. The bank has a night manager, she said. I know this because I processed a transaction at 2 in the morning for Elias once, during a crisis that couldn't wait for business hours. There's a protocol. I have the number. Roman looked at her. If Elias was counting on the bank opening at 8 to be the trigger event, she said, then we change the timeline. We pull the files now. We're ahead of whatever they're watching for. She paused. And I think we do something else. Something Mara Voss won't expect. Tell me, Roman said. She told him. The room was quiet for 3 seconds after she finished. Then Petra said, to no one in particular, That's either the best idea I've heard tonight, or we're all going to jail. Roman almost smiled. It was, again, the almost version, but closer this time. Call the bank, he said. The night manager of the bank was a precise, unsurprised woman named Mrs. Adler, who had apparently handled 2 in the morning retrieval requests before and had the specific professional equanimity of someone who'd decided long ago that unusual was just another kind of usual. Seraphina made the call, used the account identifiers, explained that she needed access under emergency retrieval protocol, and Mrs. Adler said she'd have the box ready in 40 minutes. They were there in 35. The box contained 4 things: the Whitmore documentation, 22 pages, organized chronologically; the incorporation filing for the Cayman Holding Company and its connection to the Meridian Report, 11 pages; a USB drive with encrypted files she'd built over 18 months of quietly saving things she couldn't unsave once she'd seen them; and a sealed envelope she'd placed in the box 8 months ago, on a day when something had shifted in her relationship with Elias, and she'd understood, for the first time with clarity rather than suspicion, that it was going to end. She'd written herself a letter. In it, as precisely and completely as she could, she documented her own role. What she'd covered, what she'd facilitated by keeping her mouth closed, what she'd known and chosen not to act on, and the reasons for that choice. Roman looked at the envelope. "Private," she said. He didn't ask again. She put it in her bag. They were back in the car with all 4 items in Roman's inside pocket by 5:41 in the morning. The next 2 hours were the most dense 2 hours Seraphina Vale had ever lived through, including the 3-hour crisis she'd managed alone in a hotel room in Chicago 18 months ago, when Elias's Del Vecchio exposure had nearly come apart at the seams, including the night her mother had been in the hospital when Seraphina was 19, and she'd had to make decisions on behalf of people who were supposed to be making decisions on her behalf. Roman worked. The word was insufficient. He worked the way a conductor works, not playing any single instrument, but holding the full architecture of the sound in his head, attending to each section, maintaining the tempo, making adjustments in real time that were invisible unless you were standing next to him, watching his hands. She worked beside him. Not for him. That distinction had been established in the garage, and it held. She worked beside him, with her specific knowledge and her specific skills, and the legal pad that kept acquiring more notation. And she was aware as the hours passed that this was what she'd been doing for 3 years, in the wrong room with the wrong person, and the awareness had both the sting of regret and the clarity of a thing correctly named. At 6:30, the Meridian Report published a piece. The alert came through on Petra's tablet, and Petra read it aloud. An article with Roman Castellano's name in the headline, detailing alleged financial irregularities in his organization's legitimate holdings, citing 3 anonymous sources, published at 6:30 in the morning, because 6:30 in the morning was when digital content got indexed for the news cycle, when it had the best chance of being picked up and amplified before anyone could respond. Seraphina read the article on Petra's tablet. She saw, in the second paragraph, a detail she recognized. Not in its substance. The substance was distorted, weaponized, but in its structure. The specific way the information was organized, the particular angle of approach to the financial architecture it was describing. "This didn't come from Mara's network," she said. Everyone looked at her. "This structure, the way the financial argument is assembled, this is Elias's work, or someone using his analysis framework." She read the second paragraph again. "Elias built this. He's been building it. This isn't Mara's operation using the Meridian Report. This is the Meridian Report being run as Elias's primary weapon, with Mara providing the distribution network. He owns the publication," Roman said. "He controls the publication. Mara provided the infrastructure to get it built and seeded. Elias has been writing the content." She looked up. "He's not a passenger in this, Roman. He's the architect." The thing that happened to Roman's face was not something she'd seen before. Something that had been held, contained, managed through the entire evening, through the gala and the corridor and the garage and the operations room and all the hours between, finally arrived on the surface of him for one visible second. Then it was gone. "Petra," he said. "Already moving," Petra said from the doorway. "The Meridian Report's hosting infrastructure. I want it documented in dark before 8 o'clock. "That's, Petra paused, checking something on her tablet. 70 minutes. 70 minutes, Roman confirmed. Seraphina looked at him. Documenting the ownership structure, circulating it to the right people, that's a message to Elias and Mara both. But it's also a declaration. Once you do that, there's no quiet version of this, he said. "I know." He looked at her directly, and the steadiness in it was a different kind than earlier, so not the deliberate composure, not the managed attention, something more fundamental. You said, in the garage, that you were going to have to do things you hadn't decided if you were capable of. Yes. Are you still uncertain? She thought about the letter in her bag, the one she'd written to herself 8 months ago. No, she said. Then tell me what you want to do with the Whitmore file. She had been thinking about this for 3 hours. She had been thinking about it since the bank, since the moment she'd held the documents in her hands in the fluorescent light of the vault room and understood their full weight. I want to hand it to someone who isn't you, she said. He held her gaze. I want it in the hands of someone who can use it as a legal instrument, not an operational one, she said. A federal prosecutor I'm aware of who has been building a case related to East Coast financial irregularities for 18 months. If the Whitmore file and the incorporation documents go to that office, through a channel that documents my provision of them, it creates a paper trail that protects me, and it creates a legal problem for Elias that he cannot manage the way he manages his other problems. Roman was quiet. It also creates a legal problem that will draw scrutiny toward his involvement with Mara Voss, she said, which means scrutiny toward Mara's operation, which means exposure for the intelligence infrastructure she spent 5 years building. She paused. It doesn't destroy everything tonight, but it starts a process that is very difficult to stop once it's started. He stood. Do you trust this prosecutor? He said. I trust her institutional incentives, she said, which is better than trust. Make the contact, he said. She made the contact. The federal prosecutor's name was Dana Reeves, and she picked up the phone at 6:54 in the morning on the second ring, which told Seraphina something about the kind of person she was, the kind who kept the phone close, who ran on the same fuel as the situation required regardless of the hour. Seraphina had researched Dana Reeves extensively during the Whitmore documentation process, had read 17 pieces of public reporting on her cases, had decided then and maintained the decision since. This was a person of genuine institutional principle operating in a world that made that difficult, which made her both trustworthy and dangerous in the way that principled people were always dangerous to everyone with exposure. The conversation was 4 minutes long. At the end of it, Dana Reeves said, "If what you're describing is what you're saying it is, you should know this goes all the way. I don't stop at Mercer." Seraphina understood that meant Roman. "I know," she said, "and you're handing it to me anyway." With counsel present and full documentation of my own role. She paused. "I'm not asking for immunity. I'm asking for transparency." A brief silence. "Come in at 9. She ended the call. She looked at Roman. "She'll want everything," she said, "including what she can build toward you." "I know." "You're not going to try to stop it." "If I tried to stop it," he said, "everything you just said about institutional trust would evaporate, and then we'd have an actual problem." He looked at the legal pad, at the notation she'd built through the night. Dana Reeves going into Elias's finances will find Mara Voss's fingerprints within 60 days. What she builds from there is outside my control and inside legal infrastructure I can't manage, which means Mara's operation gets dismantled by a mechanism she can't counter. He paused. "It's the correct play." "You worked it out before I made the call," she said. "I worked it out while you were making the call." A pause. "You were 3 seconds ahead of me." It was the closest thing to a concession she'd heard from him. She filed it. At 7:15, Elias Mercer called her. She was at the window on the second floor of the brownstone, watching the street get light, holding a coffee that had been handed to her by someone at some point in the last hour. She looked at the screen. His name, his number, the specific weight of 3 years and 11 digits. She answered it. "You went to the bank," he said. Not a question. He knew. Which meant Mara's network had reached the bank somehow. A camera, a contact, a data pull on the access logs, something. The knowledge that she'd moved at 5 in the morning was already in his hands. "I did," she said. "Seraphina." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not the practiced flatness of the penthouse or the performative urgency of the Aldrich floor. Something raw. Something that might, in a different context, have sounded like fear. "Whatever he's told you, whatever version of this he's given you, you are standing in a situation you don't fully understand." "I understand it completely," she said. "You've known him for one night. I've known you for 3 years. She kept her voice even. You spent 18 months building a media weapon against him while sleeping beside me. You funded an intelligence operation against his organization using accounts I managed. You positioned me to walk into his world carrying exactly the information you needed delivered. She paused. Was any of it, about anything other than that? The silence lasted 4 seconds. I cared about you, he said. The words arrived in a register she hadn't expected. Not performed, not strategic, something that might have been the most honest thing he'd said to her in 3 years, which made it the most devastating thing he'd said in 3 years, because it meant the caring had coexisted with the calculation the entire time, and she'd only ever seen one of them. I believe that, she said, and she did, which was its own specific cruelty. Goodbye, Elias. She ended the call. She stood at the window and watched a delivery truck move down the empty early morning street and let the feeling be whatever it was going to be for exactly 30 seconds. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. The next 90 minutes were the operational heart of everything. Petra's team got the Meridian Report's hosting infrastructure documented and dark at 7:48, 12 minutes inside the deadline, which was not comfortable but was sufficient. The documentation, circulated through 2 financial journalism networks, landed like a quiet grenade in the media environment. The Meridian Report had been revealed as a proprietary asset of Elias Mercer's Cayman Holding Company, which meant every piece of coverage the publication had run in 13 months was now contextualized as coordinated financial warfare rather than independent journalism. The response was not immediate. Responses like that never were. But the fuse was lit, and Seraphina knew from 3 years of managing Elias's narrative exposure exactly how long that fuse was and exactly where it burned to. At 8:20, Roman received a message from Aldrich Poole. He read it, turned the phone to show her. 2 sentences. I understand the situation has changed. I'm prepared to discuss terms of withdrawal. She looked at it. He's not done, she said. That's a stall. Yes, Roman agreed. But it tells us what he knows. He knows about Reeves. He knows about the Meridian documentation. He's trying to buy time to separate himself from Mara before the legal machinery starts moving. He'll give her up, she said. He already is, Roman said. The message implies it. She thought about Mara Voss, the woman she'd spoken to for 4 minutes on a phone in the back of a car, whose voice had been precise and cultured and carrying something underneath the strategy, a genuine wound 5 years old that had organized itself into an architecture of retaliation. Seraphina did not like Mara Voss. She did not sympathize with what Mara had built or what she'd been willing to do with it, but she understood it, and the understanding made her careful with how she thought about what was coming. She's not going to go quietly, she said. No, Roman said. What does she have left? He was quiet for a moment. She has one significant remaining asset, a person inside my organization, someone with access to my financial structure. She's been running this person for, I believe, approximately 18 months. You know who it is, she said. I've suspected for 3 months. I haven't moved on it because the asset was also a source of information about what Mara knew. He looked at her. It becomes a problem now because Mara knows she's losing the operational ground. A desperate source with deep access is more dangerous than a stable one. You need to move on them now, she said, before she activates. Within the hour, he said. Yes. She looked at the clock. 8:31. 29 minutes before the meeting with Dana Reeves. Tell me the name, she said. He looked at her. If I'm walking into that meeting in 30 minutes, she said, and I'm handing over documents that touch your organization, I need to know the complete current state of your vulnerabilities. Not for Reeves, for my own understanding. She held his gaze. No false floors. He nodded once. He told her the name. She didn't recognize it immediately. Then she did. Not from Roman's world, from Elias's. A peripheral figure, someone she'd processed a transaction for once, whose name appeared in the background of 2 documents she'd seen in the Whitmore file research. The intersection was not coincidence. He's connected to Elias, she said. Through Mara, Roman said. He's the triangle's 3rd point. She understood the geometry. Elias at one corner, Mara at another, this person at the 3rd. A structure designed so that if any single node was cut, the other two could rebuild around the loss. It was the same basic structure she'd used to protect Elias's exposure for 3 years, inverted and aimed at Roman. It was, she noted with a cold clarity, her own work turned against her. She built it using my framework, she said. Roman looked at her sharply. The documentation structure I used for the Whitmore file, the shell architecture, the separation of institutional knowledge from operational knowledge, I developed that for Elias over 3 years. Mara had access to 18 months of my work through the intelligence she was running inside Elias's organization. She felt the specific cold of it moving through her. She reverse-engineered my protection methodology and used it to protect her own operation. She knows how you think, Roman said. She knows how I used to think, Seraphina said. And something in her voice had changed with those words. She could hear it change, could feel the shift in it, the particular quality of a person arriving at a revised version of themselves that is not a contradiction, but a completion. She built her infrastructure for a version of me that was still working for Elias, a version that was protecting someone else's interests with my own methods. She stood up. What I built for Elias, she said, I can take apart. I know every seam in it. If she used my framework, I know where its vulnerabilities are. I built them in, deliberately, as fail-safes. She looked at Roman. Give me access to what you have on her operation. The intelligence from the internal source, the financial architecture you've been mapping. Give me everything. You have 28 minutes before Reeves. I can work in 28 minutes, she said. He gave her access. She worked. The legal pad filled up, and she flipped to a second one, and it filled too, and she was working in a state she recognized from the best hours of the last 3 years. The hours when the problem was genuinely complex, and the room was quiet, and her mind was running at the speed it was built to run, and every piece she touched connected to the next with the specific satisfaction of a structure that was revealing itself rather than being forced. She found the first seam at 11 minutes. The third point of the triangle, the internal source, had a secondary account structure that Mara had clearly believed was clean. It was mostly clean. But there was a transaction 11 months ago, a single transaction, where the timing created an overlap with a legitimate payroll cycle in Roman's organization. And the overlap created a documentation trail that would be, to the right reader in the right regulatory context, unmistakable. She found the second seam at 17 minutes. The Meridian Report's content archives, now publicly documented as Elias's asset, contained 3 articles that, cross-referenced with dates in the Whitmore file, established a direct operational sequence. The articles hadn't been published to inform. They'd been published as signals. Content drops to coordinate timing between Elias and Mara's network. She could prove it with a 2-page document that anyone with financial journalism experience could follow. She found the third seam at 23 minutes, and the third one was the one that mattered. She sat very still for a moment when she found it. Roman was across the table, on the phone, managing something she wasn't tracking. Petra was at the door. The room had the particular density of a space where several parallel operations were running simultaneously. She said nothing for 30 seconds. Then, Roman. He ended his call. She turned the legal pad toward him. He read the notation. She watched him read it, watched the moment he arrived at what she'd found, watched his eyes stop moving, watched the pause. Where is this? He said. 14th month back, she said. Before the belladonna. Before anything visible. She pointed. This transfer, this specific transfer, doesn't go to Poole's operation. It doesn't go to the Meridian. It's a capital injection into a structure that, based on the registration pattern, is a property holding in, she said the location. His face changed completely. That's my mother's house, he said. The room was very quiet. The property your mother lives in, she said carefully, has been receiving capital injections for 14 months through a shell structure that connects through 3 intermediaries to a Voss-controlled account. She's been funding my mother's property, or, Seraphina said, she's been quietly acquiring a financial position in it, through instruments your mother wouldn't recognize as anything other than routine financial management. She paused. If those injections are structured as debt instruments rather than gifts, she could call them, Roman said. On a timeline of her choosing, Seraphina said. If she feels her operation collapsing, if she needs a lever that isn't operational, isn't intelligence-based, something personal, something that Roman was already on the phone. She heard him say his mother's name, heard the quality of his voice change in a way that told her more about him in 3 seconds than the entire evening had told her, because it was the only moment when the architecture was entirely down and what was there was simply a man and a person he loved and the fear of having failed to protect her. He spoke for 40 seconds. He ended the call. His hand was flat on the table. She did not say anything. She had learned in the last several hours the specific grammar of when Roman Castellano needed silence and when he needed the next thing, and this was silence. 14 seconds, then, "She's safe." His voice was the controlled version, back in place, but the seam was visible, slightly. "She's with my sister in Connecticut. She's been there for a week." He looked up. "I moved her without telling Mara's source, which means Mara doesn't know she's not in the house. Mara thinks she still has that lever," Seraphina said. "Yes." "Then we have something she doesn't know we have." Seraphina looked at the legal pad. "We know about the property position. She doesn't know we know. She thinks it's her emergency move, the thing she holds back until she needs it." "We let her believe that," Roman said, "until we don't." She understood. At 8:59, she picked up her bag, the documents in a manila envelope that Petra had sealed with the specific care of someone who knew what was inside it, and she stood at the door of the operations room. Roman was on the other side of the table. "After Reeves," he said. "After Reeves," she said. She left the brownstone and got into the car with Petra, and the city was mourning now. Properly mourning. Light on the buildings, people moving on the sidewalks, the ordinary texture of a day that had no idea what had happened in it already. Petra drove south. Seraphina sat in the back and looked at the city and thought about Mara Voss, who had spent 5 years building something extraordinary in the wrong direction, who had taken a genuine wound and turned it into a machine, who had used Seraphina's own methods against her without knowing that Seraphina was no longer the person who'd built those methods. She thought about the moment in the garage, the cold concrete under her palms, the decision point. She'd made the decision. She was still making it. The car moved downtown through morning traffic, and she looked at the manila envelope in her lap, and she thought about the letter in her bag, the one she'd written to herself, the accounting of what she'd known and what she'd covered and the reasons for it. And she understood that the letter was the thing she hadn't known she was carrying toward this specific morning for 8 months. Dana Reeves's office was in a federal building on Worth Street, gray and institutional, the kind of building whose architecture said, "The mechanisms here do not care about your narrative." She took that as clarifying. She went through security. She signed in. She sat in a waiting room with hard plastic chairs and fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly like they hadn't slept, which in her case was accurate, and she held the manila envelope on her knees and she made herself feel the weight of it. 30 years of her life. 3 years of proximity to a world she'd told herself she was managing rather than inhabiting. One night that had changed the coordinates of everything. And somewhere on the other side of this morning, in an apartment whose address she hadn't shared, Mara Voss was working toward a lever she thought she still had. Ms. Vale, a woman in the doorway, 40s, direct gaze, the specific quality of someone whose professional identity had been built entirely on adversarial context. Dana Reeves. Seraphina stood. She offered her hand. Dana Reeves shook it and looked at the manila envelope and then looked at Seraphina's face with the specific attention of someone who was reading the human being as carefully as the documents. "You look like you've been awake all night," Reeves said. "I have," Seraphina said. "Good," Reeves said. "So have I. Come in." The door closed behind them. And on the other side of the city, in a building on the Upper West Side, Roman Castellano stood at the window of the operations room and looked at the morning and waited for his phone to ring. And when it did, when the call came from the number he'd been watching, the number that would tell him whether the next phase had begun or whether they still had room to work, he answered it before it rang twice, the way he answered everything, with the complete attention of a man who had learned long ago that information was the only currency that mattered. The voice on the other end said one word. And Roman Castellano closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a man closes his eyes when something he has been preparing for has finally, irrevocably arrived. The word Roman heard on the phone was now. He stood at the window of the operations room for exactly the 1 second he'd allowed himself, eyes closed, and in that second he let himself feel the full weight of what now meant. Not fear, not quite, but the thing adjacent to it that a man like him had learned to metabolize into fuel rather than paralysis. The recognition that the controlled burn had become a wildfire, that the variables he'd been managing had converged into a single irreversible moment, and that the next hours would decide things that could not be undecided. Then the second was over. He opened his eyes. "Petra," he said. She was already in the doorway. "She activated the property instrument," he said. "The call just came from the legal firm she's been using as the instrument holder. They've sent formal notice to my mother's address in Connecticut." He looked at Petra. "She doesn't know my mother isn't there." Petra understood instantly. "She's showing her hand. She's showing her hand because she knows Reeves has the documents. She knows because Poole told her Poole was buying time when he sent that withdrawal message. And part of the price was feeding Mara the information that Seraphina had gone to the federal building." He moved from the window toward the table. "She's not trying to win anymore. She's trying to negotiate from leverage she thinks she still has." "Which means she wants a call," Petra said. "She wants a call," Roman confirmed. "She wants me to come to the table. She wants whatever version of the original arrangement she can still salvage." He stood at the table and looked at the legal pad Seraphina had left there. The notation in 2 different handwriting rhythms, his, which was sparse, and hers, which was dense and lateral and architecturally intricate, the kind of notation that told you the mind behind it thought in systems rather than sequences. He looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. "Call Mara Voss," he said. "Tell her I'm willing to talk. Tell her I'll meet her. 1 hour." Petra looked at him. "Location." "Her choice," he said. "Let her pick the ground. I want her comfortable." "And Seraphina?" "She's with Reeves." He looked at the clock. "She'll be done in 40 minutes if the meeting runs short, probably 60. He paused. "Don't pull her out. What she's doing with Reeves is the mechanism. Let it run." "And if Mara moves before the meeting?" Roman looked at Petra with the specific expression she'd seen from him only a handful of times in the years she'd worked for him. Not cold, not hard, but settled, the way a stone is settled when it's been in the same place long enough to become part of the ground. "Then we'll know what she actually is," he said. Dead. Mara Voss chose a hotel bar in Midtown. Neutral ground, she'd have calculated. Public enough to preclude violence. Private enough in its ambient noise to prevent easy surveillance. She was not wrong that it was strategically sound. She was wrong that it was neutral. Roman had been in that bar 4 times. He knew the staff, the layout, the acoustics, the 3 exit routes. He arrived 11 minutes before the appointed time, which meant he was there when she walked in, which meant she'd lost the first small exchange before she'd sat down. She was smaller than he'd expected. He had his own memory of Mara Voss from 8 years ago, the woman who'd come to his father's office, then to his, making her case with the precision of someone who'd spent years building arguments for boardrooms. He'd been 33. She'd been, he calculated, somewhere around 40. She was 48 now, and the years had done the specific thing years did to people who spent them in a state of directed obsession. They'd refined her, burned away everything that wasn't essential. She was angular, precise, dressed in something dark and quietly expensive, with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who'd been reading rooms for so long the rooms were transparent to her. She sat down across from him. She didn't speak first. Neither did he. They held the silence for 5 seconds, which was longer than most people could hold a silence with Roman Castellano, and he registered that. "You moved her," she said finally. "His mother." She meant his mother. "Yes." "When?" "A week ago." He let her work out what that meant, that the lever she'd spent 14 months building and activated this morning had been toothless for a week, that she'd used her emergency move against a position he'd already vacated. Something moved across her face. Not defeat. She wasn't there yet. But the specific recalculation of someone whose map has just been revised. "The Reeves meeting," she said, "is happening now." That was her idea. Not a question. "Yes." Mara looked at her hands for a moment. She had the hands of someone who worked, not labor, but the particular worn precision of someone who used their hands for sustained, detailed work. She's been in your world for one night, she said, and she's already changed your response pattern. She changed it because she was right, Roman said. She's going to change more than your response pattern. Mara looked up. Her voice had shifted slightly. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that was older than strategy. She's going to ask things of you that you don't know yet you're not prepared for. Not because she's dangerous to your organization, because she's... She stopped. And the stop was the most human moment in the conversation. She's the kind of person who makes the people around her larger than they intended to be. And that is its own particular difficulty. Roman held her gaze. You're describing yourself. The silence that followed was different from the first one, heavier. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't expected and could not entirely categorize. Not grief, exactly, not anger, something that had started as both of those a long time ago and had metabolized into something quieter and more permanent. I built something extraordinary, she said, for your father. The financial architecture, the structures that turned a street operation into a legitimate empire. That was mine. I made that. And when he was gone, I came to you, and you... Her voice didn't waver. She'd made sure of it, but the effort was visible in the set of her jaw. You looked at what I'd built and what I was offering, and you made a calculation. I was a cost to be managed, not a person to be honored. You're right, Roman said. She blinked. It was a small blink, nearly invisible, but he saw it. The involuntary response to hearing something you've been rehearsing the fight for simply arrive without a fight. I was 33 years old and I was afraid, he said. Not of you. Of the size of what I'd inherited. Of the distance between the organization as it was and my ability to run it at that level. And you came to me with claims I couldn't verify, and a grief I didn't know how to hold, and I made a calculation that was clean and logical and wrong. He didn't look away. I've known it was wrong for several years. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Mara Voss sat very still. I'm not asking you to stop what's coming, he said. The Reeves meeting is running. The Meridian documentation is public. Poole has withdrawn. The structural damage to your operation is real and most of it can't be undone. He paused. I'm asking you to tell me what you actually wanted. Not the organization, not the operation. What you wanted when you came to me 8 years ago that I didn't give you. She looked at him for a long time. I wanted to be told that what I built mattered, she said, that my name was attached to it somewhere. Not publicly. I never needed publicly. I just needed someone who knew what I'd made to say it, and mean it, and act accordingly. The bar moved around them, quiet morning traffic of hotel guests and business breakfasts, the ordinary ambient noise of people conducting their ordinary lives. What you built, Roman said, is the foundation of everything I have. It's in every financial structure that generates revenue for my organization. Your methodology is in the wall of every legitimate business I own. Your name is not on any of it, and it should be, and that is a wrong I made that I cannot fully correct now. He paused. But I can say it directly. To you. It mattered. Enormously. And the man who didn't say it when you needed him to was me, not my father. She looked at him. Then she looked at the table. When she looked up again, something in her face was different. Not resolved, not healed. Those were not things that happened in a hotel bar in 40 minutes. But something had come out of suspension. Some long-held thing that had been waiting for somewhere to land had found a place, inadequate as it was. The property instrument, she said. I'll have the legal firm withdraw it today. Thank you. And the internal source... She paused. He came to me. I want you to know that. I didn't recruit him specifically. He approached through a contact. He was unhappy with something in his arrangement, and he came looking for an alternative. I know, Roman said. That doesn't change what has to happen. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She stood. She straightened her jacket with a small, precise gesture that told him something about the discipline she'd built herself around over 5 years of single-minded purpose. She looked at him one final time with an expression that was not warm and not cold and not simple. She's better than either of us, Mara said, at the thing that matters most. She paused. Don't ruin her. Then she walked out of the bar. He sat for a moment. Then he paid for the 2 coffees that had never been touched and left. Hug. Seraphina came out of the federal building at 10:47. The morning was full bright now, the kind of October clarity that Manhattan occasionally produced as if to demonstrate what it was capable of when it stopped performing. Cold, sharp, the sky a specific shade of blue that didn't apologize for itself. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building and took a breath that went all the way in for the first time, and she tried to count, couldn't. The meeting with Dana Reeves had run 93 minutes. She had brought the documents, the sealed letter, and an account of her own role that she delivered with the same precision she applied to everything. Not softened, not dramatized, not managed. Dana Reeves had listened with the specific quality of a professional who had developed genuine neutrality over years of adversarial work. And at the end, she'd said, "This is sufficient to open a formal investigation into Mercer's organizational finances and the media operation. The foreign intelligence angles are above my direct jurisdiction, but I'll brief up today." A pause. "Your cooperation is documented. Your legal exposure is real but manageable given the proactive disclosure." Another pause. "Don't leave the country." Seraphina had said she had no plans to. She stood on Worth Street now and looked at the city, and she was aware of what the morning contained and what it had already spent. Elias was somewhere in it, probably in a room with lawyers, beginning to understand the shape of what was coming for him. Mara Voss was somewhere in it, and Seraphina didn't know yet what had happened in that meeting, only that Roman had texted her one word while she'd been with Reeves: "Done." Aldrich Poole was somewhere in it, rebuilding his calculus. The internal source, whose name she now knew, was somewhere in it, and that situation would be handled by Roman today, which meant handled with more precision and less cruelty than it would have been handled with 6 months ago, she believed, because she intended to be present for it. Her phone rang. Roman. "How did it go?" he said. "Reeves is opening the investigation." She started walking, no particular direction, just the need to move. "She'll move on Mercer's financial structures within 2 weeks. The Meridian documentation is her lead. The Whitmore files are corroborating." She paused. "She made it clear my own exposure is real. I have a legal team that I have my own legal representation," she said. "I've had the same attorney for 4 years. I'm calling her this afternoon." A brief pause. "Of course. Mara," she said. "We spoke." "What happened?" He told her. He gave it to her completely. The conversation, Mara's acknowledgement of the property withdrawal, the thing Mara had said at the end. He didn't edit it, didn't manage it, gave her the last line verbatim. She stopped walking. She was standing in front of a coffee cart on a corner she didn't immediately recognize, the smell of something ordinary and necessary in the cold air. "She's better than either of us. Don't ruin her." "What did you say to her?" Seraphina asked. "Before that. What did you say that got you to that moment?" He told her that too. She stood on the corner and listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment that was not empty. It was full, pressed with something that she needed space to feel. "That was the right thing," she said. "What you said to her." "It was the true thing," he said, "which isn't always the same." "For you it is," she said. "I've noticed." Another pause, different from the earlier ones, softer at the edges. "Come back," he said. "There are things to finish today, and I'd rather finish them with you here." "I need 30 minutes," she said. "There's something I have to do first." She bought a coffee from the cart, and she found a bench in a small park 3 blocks from Worth Street, and she sat in the clear October light, and she opened her bag and she took out the sealed envelope. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. She read the letter she'd written to herself 8 months ago in the quiet of her own apartment. On a night when Elias had been at an event she hadn't been invited to, and she'd sat at her kitchen table and understood, with the specific clarity that only arrived in solitude, exactly what she'd been doing and exactly why, and exactly what it was costing her. The letter was 4 pages. Her handwriting was neat and slightly right-leaning, the handwriting of someone who'd been taught to slow down and hadn't quite managed it. She'd written in complete sentences, which she did even in private, because incomplete sentences felt dishonest. She'd written about the Whitmore file and what she'd known when she'd found it. She'd written about the 2 leverage opportunities she'd chosen not to use and the reasons for that choice. Loyalty, she'd written then. But she was reading it now, and the word felt insufficient for what she'd meant, which was something closer to, I still believed at those moments that I was choosing to be inside a relationship rather than a transaction, and choosing that required me to not use what the transaction gave me. She'd been wrong, of course, about being in a relationship rather than a transaction, but the choice had still come from somewhere real. She'd written about her mother briefly, and about the specific shape of the family she'd come from. Not damaged, not traumatic, just the ordinary limitation of people who showed love in the form of provision rather than presence, and how that had made her specifically susceptible to accepting competence as a substitute for being seen. She'd written at the end one sentence that she read twice now. I know that when this ends, I will not be the same size I am now. I will be either smaller or larger, and which one depends on choices I cannot currently see. She folded the letter. She didn't put it back in the envelope. She held it for a moment, the 4 pages, the weight of the person she'd been when she'd written it. Careful, tired, still hoping that the situation would resolve itself without requiring her to act. Then she found a trash can at the edge of the park, and she dropped it in. Not destroyed, not burned, just released. She didn't need it anymore. The accounting it contained was in Dana Reeves's possession now, in the formal language of legal disclosure rather than the private language of a woman writing to herself in the dark. And the version of herself that had needed to write it had already stepped aside for the version that was going to have to deal with what came next. She sat for 10 more minutes. She looked at the trees, which were turning, October doing its slow, brilliant work on the leaves. She looked at a dog being walked by someone who looked like they'd rather be sleeping. She looked at the sky, blue and clear and genuinely indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 14 hours. Then she picked up her coffee, which was still warm enough, and she called a car and went back to the brownstone. The rest of that day was work, not the compressed high-velocity work of the previous hours. Something more deliberate, the kind of work that follows a crisis and begins to build on the ground the crisis cleared. Roman handled the internal source personally, which she'd asked to observe and he'd agreed to, and she watched him do it with the specific, careful brutality of a man who understood that the truth was usually the most humane available option. The source, a man named Callum, 40s, with the specific look of someone who'd made a choice he'd rationalized for long enough that the rationalizations had started to feel like reasons, sat across a table from Roman and was given the complete picture of what had been discovered and what it meant. He didn't deny it. He looked, mostly, at the table. When he spoke, his voice was thin in the way voices got thin when the structure had gone out of them. I told myself it was information, not action. I wasn't doing anything, just passing information is the action, Roman said. Not unkind, final. You knew that. Callum looked up. He saw Seraphina at the edge of the room, and something in his face changed briefly. Surprise. Recognition of what she represented, and then settled back into resignation. What happens now? He said. You're going to help us clean what you left open, Roman said. Everything you passed, every access you granted, every channel you used, full accounting. When that's done, you're going to leave, and the separation agreement will be complete and final, and will not be violated by either party. A pause. That's what happens now. Callum nodded. The nod of a man who'd expected worse and understood that the absence of worse was not forgiveness, but a transaction with its own terms. Seraphina left the room halfway through the technical accounting that followed, because her presence wasn't needed for it, and because she had her own calls to make. She called her attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had been her personal counsel since Seraphina's second year with Elias, and who was, like Dana Reeves, the kind of person whose professional reliability derived from the structural integrity of her principles rather than the flexibility of them. Patricia listened to the summary of the previous 20 hours with the silence of someone taking notes and asked 3 clarifying questions and said, You made the disclosure proactively and completely? Yes? Before or after any formal inquiry was opened? Before, significantly before. Good. Don't speak to anyone else without me. I'll review what Reeves received and we'll talk this afternoon. She ended the call. She stood in the hallway of the brownstone and she felt for the first time the full weight of what was suspended over her head. Not panic, but the sober recognition of legal exposure that was real, that would require management, that would cost money and time and the specific energy of being under scrutiny. She had made the choice with full understanding of this. She made it again, standing in the hallway, in the clear-eyed way that choices needed to be remade after the adrenaline was gone and the ordinary consequence was visible. Yes, she thought, still. Elias Mercer called once more that afternoon. She didn't answer. An hour later, she received a message from his attorney. Formal, professionally courteous, indicating that Mr. Mercer was aware of certain information that had been provided to federal authorities and wished to open a dialogue regarding mutual interests. She forwarded it to Patricia Holt without comment. She didn't hear from Elias again. She heard from Mara Voss once, 3 days later. A message, not a call. Brief, written in the same precise register as the phone call had been. It said, "The legal firm has formally withdrawn the property instrument. I've also closed the Meridian Report's content operations. What remains of the organizational infrastructure I built is being dissolved. I thought you should know, since you were the one who found the seam." Seraphina read it twice. Then she wrote back, "I did. Thank you for telling me." She thought about adding something, some acknowledgement of what Mara had said in the bar, the words she'd learned from Roman, "She's better than either of us." But she didn't add it. Some things didn't need to be completed in language. The message was enough. The transaction they'd had in the space of this crisis, the woman on the other side of a phone call at midnight, and the woman sitting in a car trying to decide what she was and what she wasn't, it was enough to acknowledge it had happened. She set the phone down. Watching. 6 months passed. Not quietly. There was nothing quiet about the 6 months that followed. The federal investigation into Elias Mercer's financial operations opened formally in November and expanded twice. The Meridian Report's ownership disclosure generated a secondary wave of journalism about coordinated financial propaganda that became, for 3 weeks, the story that everyone who covered organized crime and media intersection was writing about. Seraphina spoke to federal attorneys 4 times, with Patricia Holt present at every meeting, and each time she gave the same complete accounting she'd given Dana Reeves on Worth Street at 9 in the morning after the longest night of her life. Her legal exposure resolved in February, not eliminated, but managed into a formal cooperation agreement that Patricia called "as good as this category of situation gets," which Seraphina accepted as a conclusion that was accurate without being satisfying. She worked. The work was different from anything she'd done before, not in its mechanics, which were familiar, but in its nature. She was building something rather than maintaining someone else's thing. The financial restructuring of Roman's legitimate holdings took 4 months and required her to use every skill she'd developed over 3 years with Elias in ways that were finally correctly oriented, building protective structures rather than concealment structures, creating transparency where it was legally strategic rather than obscuring opacity for its own sake. She made mistakes. 3 of them significant enough to require correction, and 1 significant enough to require a difficult conversation with Roman at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when she'd been at her desk for 14 hours and her eyes hurt, and she was past the point of managing her own presentation. "I misread the Harmon subsidiary structure," she said. "I built the model on an assumption about the cash flow timing that was wrong, and the tax exposure we're carrying into Q1 is higher than I projected." He looked at the numbers she'd put in front of him. "By how much?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "What's the correction?" 2 options. She walked him through them. He listened, asked 2 questions, chose the second option, which was the one she'd have chosen. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything about the mistake." "I'm going to say it was a reasonable assumption on incomplete information and the correction is clean." He looked at her. "Is that not what happened?" "It is what happened." "Then that's what I'm going to say." He looked back at the numbers. "You built a model that assumed good faith from the Harmon principles about their cash timing. The Harmon principles weren't operating in good faith. That's information we now have." He paused. "The mistake was trusting people who didn't deserve it. I've made that mistake." She sat with that. "You're not going to tell me to stop trusting people," she said. "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you to keep trusting people and keep the correction mechanism clean. The alternative is the thing Mara did, which is to stop trusting entirely and build systems that assume everyone is opposition. That's efficient, and it's also a way to eventually be alone in a room of mechanisms and call it an organization." She looked at him. "That's the most I've heard you say about Mara," she said. "I've been thinking about it," he said. about what I created. He looked at the papers, and she could see in the set of his face the thing that was not guilt exactly, but was in its neighborhood. The long adult reckoning with a consequence you can't undo, only carry. I've been thinking about what she built, and how much of it was genuine talent that went in the wrong direction because I was 33 and afraid, and made a clean decision instead of a human one. He paused. That's a lesson I intend to keep learning. She looked at him for a moment. So do I, she said. They worked for another 2 hours and then she went home to the apartment she'd taken in November in a building 6 blocks from the brownstone. Her own place, her own lease, her own things arranged in her own order, which was a specific kind of freedom she'd undervalued for 3 years and was no longer undervaluing. The second Belladonna Gala fell in the first week of April. She knew the date. She'd known it for months. The Aldrich had been repaired. The damage from the charge had been modest, structurally, and the Aldrich's board had determined that the event's disruption was best addressed by continuing the tradition unchanged. The gala was a statement, as it always had been. Attending was a statement. Not attending was also a statement. She was attending. She had a different dress this time. Not silver black, not the dress she'd bought for herself and worn for the first time on a night that had changed everything. This one was deep green, structured, the kind of dress that said nothing to anyone except what she chose to say. She had bought it without deliberation, which meant she'd known exactly what she wanted and had simply gone and gotten it, which was also a specific freedom she hadn't always had. Roman came to the brownstone to meet her, which she'd understood was a choice rather than a convenience. He looked at her for a moment when she came in. "Green," he said. "Green," she confirmed. Something in his expression was the full version of the thing that had spent the previous 6 months only arriving in parts. The warmth without the architecture around it. The regard without the calculation. The attention that was simply itself because it had been stripped of the need to deploy itself. She looked at him in return. He was the same in the external mechanics. The jacket made for him. The controlled posture, the specific gravity of a man who had taken what he'd been given and made it into something. But she'd been inside the architecture now for 6 months, and she knew the rooms in it, knew where the cold drafts were and where the warmth collected, knew the particular sound of his voice at 11 at night when he'd been working for too many hours, and his guard came down, and he said things that were more honest than he knew he was being. She had not told him all of that. It wasn't time yet. But it was accumulating. The way things accumulated between people who worked closely and trusted each other and hadn't yet found the exact moment to name what they were building. "Ready," he said. "Ready," she said. They went. The Aldrich was the same. The marble, the chandeliers. New ones, she noticed. The old ones presumably beyond restoration after the charge. The orchestra, the crowd of people who moved through the world at its highest and most dangerous altitudes. She had been in this room before as an administrator, before as a guest under crisis, before as a woman who'd walked in with nothing but a borrowed invitation and a decision she'd made in the raw dark of a discarded night. She walked in now as herself. It was not a small distinction. She felt the room's attention move toward them, the same ripple she'd felt 6 months ago. People adjusting, recalibrating, the particular social weather of a powerful room encountering a new configuration of power within it. But where 6 months ago the attention had been about Roman primarily, and her secondarily, about the curiosity of what she represented and what she was doing here, tonight it was different. Tonight people in this room knew her name. They knew her work. They knew that the Castellano organization's legitimate financial holdings had been restructured over the previous 6 months, and that the restructuring had produced results that people in this room tracked, because people in this room always tracked results. A senator she recognized from the previous gala extended a hand and addressed her directly. She shook it. 2 men she knew from the legitimate side of Roman's holdings approached with questions about the Q1 structure, which she answered briefly and with the specific warmth she brought to professional exchange that she'd spent 3 years suppressing in Elias's world because he'd found it excessive. She found it essential. Roman was beside her and slightly apart from her, both things simultaneously, close enough that the architecture of their relationship was visible to anyone looking, far enough that she had her own space inside it, which was the exact configuration she'd needed, and that he'd been precise enough in his attention to provide without being asked. She saw Elias across the ballroom. He was there with counsel, she gathered. Two men flanking him at a slightly protective distance, the specific body language of managed attendance. He was here because not attending would have been a statement his attorneys had probably told him not to make. He looked like a man who had spent 6 months in the machinery of consequence, which was accurate because he had. He saw her. She met his gaze, not with triumph. She'd thought about that, about what she would feel in this moment, and the answer had been less satisfying than she'd anticipated in the theoretical version and more honest in the actual one. What she felt looking at Elias Mercer across the belladonna Gala was not triumph. It was something quieter and more permanent. The recognition that she was no longer organized around him in any direction. Not toward him, not against him, not in the reaction to him that had been, even in the months since, a kind of continued orientation. She looked at him and felt the space where 3 years had been and found it was just space. He looked away first. She turned back to the room. Roman was beside her, close enough that she could speak quietly. "How are you doing?" he said. The same thing he'd said to her 6 months ago at the top of the Aldrich steps. Not quite a question, an observation framed as courtesy. She looked at him. "I've been better," she said. "I've been worse." The same answer she'd given him 6 months ago. He recognized it. She could see that he recognized it, could see it in the slight shift of his expression, the thing that was closer to smiling now than it had been then, the warming of it. "And tonight," he said. She looked at the room, the ballroom with its new chandeliers and its orchestra and its 300 people living at the altitude of consequence. The room that had been the site of a crisis and was now simply a room. The room she'd walked into as someone else's discard and was standing in now as the thing she'd always been, just with the correct coordinates finally. "Tonight is good," she said. It was not a small thing to say. It was actually the largest thing she'd said in 6 months, because it was true without qualification, without the management of it, without the protective layer of irony or precision she'd been using to handle the enormous and sometimes frightening fact of what her life had become. Tonight was good. Roman looked at her with the full version of his attention, the kind she'd learned to hold without flinching, and she held it. And in the space between them was everything that had been built in the previous 6 months, and everything that was still being built, and the specific quality of two people who had been tested by something serious and had come through it to a place where the testing was part of the structure rather than a wound in it. "Then let's stay a while," he said. They stayed. The orchestra played. The city moved outside the glass. The people of this world, in all their complexity and their compromises and their genuine capacities, moved through the ballroom doing what people did at the altitude of consequence, negotiating, connecting, building, occasionally destroying, sometimes honoring the things that deserved to be honored. Seraphina Vale stood in the middle of it, in a green dress she'd bought without deliberation, beside a man who had watched her for 2 years and miscalculated and told her the truth about the miscalculation, and was standing here now in the full accounting of what they were, and she understood, not as a conclusion, not as an ending, but as the specific recognition of a thing that was alive and in motion, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she'd been placed here, because she'd chosen it. That was the difference. That had always been the difference.